Hi, everybody. Tonight, I want to take you back to a time so distant, it feels like the quiet breath of a dream. A time before electric lights, before modern medicine, before the language we speak had taken its current shape. This is a tale about how the human mind, fragile, mysterious, and endlessly misunderstood, was seen and treated during the long, winding centuries of the medieval world. Over the next 24 parts, we'll walk gently through the candlelit corridors of castles, through the wild and lonely woods where healers whispered prayers, through the echoing stone cells of monasteries, and through the bustling streets of medieval towns where madness was both feared and revered. This story will unfold slowly, like mist curling over an old churchyard at dawn. So get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let us begin. In the earliest centuries of what we now call the Middle Ages, those twilight years following the fall of Rome and preceding the birth of the Renaissance, the world was in transition. It was a time of uncertainty, of forgotten knowledge, and newly forming beliefs. Across Europe, people lived in a patchwork of feudal lands and shifting territories. Amid this uncertainty, the concept of the mind, what it was, what it meant to be sound or unsound, was blurred with religion, folklore, and ancient superstition. To understand mental health in the Middle Ages, we must first understand the framework in which people saw themselves. The dominant force shaping thought was the church. Christianity in all its medieval forms held sway over nearly every facet of life, and the human mind was no exception. Emotions, thoughts, dreams, and suffering were interpreted through the lens of sin, virtue, and divine punishment. If someone felt despair, it might be seen as the weight of their sins pressing upon their soul. If someone laughed without cause or wept for no reason, they might be seen as either possessed or deeply pious, depending on context. Visions and voices could belong to either saints or devils. The line between holiness and madness was at times so thin it almost disappeared. One of the central ideas of the time was the concept of the four humors. Inherited from ancient Greek medicine, particularly the works of Hippocrates and Galen, the idea was that the body, and by extension the mind, was governed by a balance of four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor corresponded to a temperament: sanguine, phlegmatic, choleric, or melancholic. A person with too much black bile, for instance, might be melancholic, moody, withdrawn, and prone to what we might now call depression. This medical theory was still deeply intertwined with spiritual thought. It wasn't enough to merely be out of balance physically. Such imbalance was often interpreted as the result of divine judgment. Perhaps God was displeased. Perhaps the devil had taken hold. Perhaps the stars had shifted in a way that disturbed the soul. It's important to remember that there was no real separation between body and mind, or between science and religion. A healer might prescribe herbs to calm a troubled person and then urge them to confess their sins. A monk might interpret a nobleman's sudden rage as a sign of demonic influence, but also suggest more sleep, a change in diet, or pilgrimage. It was not contradiction, it was simply how people understood the world. In small villages far from the cathedrals and universities, mental illness was often dealt with in silence or in whispers. A person who behaved strangely might be feared. They might be mocked, avoided, or driven out, but they might also be quietly accepted, especially if their oddness seemed harmless. There are records of people referred to as village idiots, a cruel term by modern standards, but in some places, such individuals were cared for by their communities in a rough, uneven sort of way. Women especially bore the weight of misunderstanding. A woman who heard voices or spoke in tongues might be hailed as a mystic, or she might be called a witch. Both designations could be deadly. Throughout the Middle Ages, the line between divine revelation and heresy was drawn not by behavior alone, but by who the person was, who they angered, and who believed them. And so, a woman in a convent who saw visions of Christ might be celebrated, even canonized after death. Meanwhile, a woman in a village who cried out to unseen spirits could be accused of witchcraft, imprisoned, tortured, or burned. Mental distress, when framed as possession or unholy pact, was not treated with compassion, but with fear and violence. In monasteries, a different world of understanding began to emerge. Monks and nuns who withdrew from the world sought peace in contemplation, but many also suffered in silence. The rule of Saint Benedict, which guided monastic life, emphasized humility, silence, and obedience. Within this quiet world, some suffered deeply. What might today be diagnosed as depression was often seen as acedia, a kind of spiritual dryness or despair, particularly dangerous to those in religious life. Acedia wasn't just sadness, it was seen as a sin, a turning away from the divine. And yet even here a gentle thread of care could be found. Some monasteries kept gardens with herbs known to calm the spirit: lavender, sage, chamomile. Monks might counsel one another in hushed voices or write about their struggles in hidden journals. While they may not have had the words we now use, their suffering was real, and sometimes their solace was too. Meanwhile, among the nobility, mental illness carried both stigma and secrecy. A lord who could no longer command respect, who wandered or spoke nonsense, became a liability. Sometimes they were quietly removed from power. Other times they were cloistered, not for healing, but for containment. In rare cases, they were sent on pilgrimage, in hopes that the journey might heal the soul through suffering, prayer, and divine intervention. And among the poorest, those who lived in the mud brick homes along the edges of towns, who worked from dawn until dark, their pain often went unnoticed, unnamed. There was no time for reflection, no safe space for despair. A man who wept too often might be cursed as weak. A woman who wailed at night might be called a banshee. Fear, ignorance, and survival left little room for tenderness. Yet even then, a strange kind of beauty flickered. There are stories of fools who were considered holy, madmen whose words were believed to carry hidden truths, and broken souls who wandered barefoot through forests and were fed by strangers who believed them touched by God. In a world so often harsh, there were, too, moments of kindness. This, then, is where our story begins. In a world where minds were mysteries, where pain could be sacred, and where suffering often wore the face of sainthood or damnation. In the next part, we'll journey deeper into the practices of healing, what remedies were offered, what rituals were performed, and what hope, if any, was held out to those whose minds began to fray. Let your eyes grow heavy now, and let this ancient tale whisper through your dreams. In the quiet hush of a medieval infirmary, nestled deep within the stone walls of an abbey, the scent of dried herbs drifted through the air. Bundles of rosemary, thyme, and valerian root hung from wooden beams, casting faint shadows in the candlelight. Here, in these cloistered spaces of contemplation and care, some of the earliest attempts to ease mental anguish took place, not with precision, but with earnest belief in centuries of inherited tradition. Medieval healing, especially for the mind, was not a singular practice, but a delicate weave of religion, folk custom, and early medicine. It began with observation, watching the troubled soul and listening, not so much to understand, but to discern whether the cause was divine, demonic, or humoral. For those believed to be merely out of balance, the response was often gentle, though bound by superstition. A monk might grind dried chamomile into a powder, steep it in hot water, and offer it as a calming tea to one racked with anxiety. For sleeplessness, crushed poppy seeds were sometimes placed in wine or ale, their dulling properties known long before science gave it a name. Honey, too, was considered healing, spread on bread and eaten in small ritualistic bites as if sweetness could coax the mind back from darkness. But healing did not end with herbs. The troubled were often brought before relics of saints, bone fragments, or old garments believed to hold miraculous power. They would kneel, trembling, before glass cases or gilded shrines, their foreheads pressed to cold stone, murmuring prayers taught to them by soft-voiced monks. It was believed that through proximity to sanctity, the mind might be cleansed, or at least quieted. Sometimes rituals took a darker turn. Exorcisms were not reserved for the obviously tormented. A woman who claimed to hear voices might be subjected to prayers of deliverance, her arms bound gently but firmly, her name called over and over by the priest as Latin syllables filled the air. Even a child who laughed too often in church might be suspected of some spiritual mischief and examined for signs of possession. Yet, not all who sought healing did so under the gaze of the church. Outside the monastery walls, in forest glades and thatched cottages, folk healers and wise women practiced their own kind of medicine. These were the midwives, the herbalists, the charm singers. They knew the ways of the plants, the rhythms of the moon, and the old incantations passed down in hushed voices from mother to daughter. To them, mental illness was often seen as a misalignment of spirit, a disturbance in the soul's song. A young man plagued by visions might be led into the woods at twilight, his body anointed with oils of lavender and clove, his breath guided by chants older than Christendom. A woman who wailed in sorrow for her lost child might be given a bundle of mugwort to sleep with and told to dream of healing, not harm. There was power in belief, and sometimes that was enough to draw someone back from the edge. Of course, these practices were dangerous to those who bore them. The church was not kind to healers who worked outside its sanctioned circle. A woman revered in one village could be denounced in another. A midwife who soothed with prayers and poultices might one day be called before the Inquisition, her kindness rebranded as witchcraft. Still, for many, these local healers were a last hope. In lands where physicians were few and often unreachable, the wisdom of the woods was more accessible than the cloisters of power. A coin or loaf of bread might purchase a charm for clarity of mind, or a protective amulet sewn from thistle and silver thread. Mothers would whisper blessings over their sleeping children, and fathers would recite old rhymes to ward off the night madness that stole sleep and peace alike. Back in the cities, among the narrow, cobbled streets of London or Paris, more formal institutions began to rise. One of the earliest known hospitals for the mentally ill in Europe was Bethlehem Royal Hospital, better known by its later name, Bedlam. Originally established as a priory, by the 13th century, it began housing those considered insane. The name would one day become synonymous with chaos, but in its earliest form, it was both refuge and prison. Records from these early institutions are sparse, but glimpses remain, of chained patients, yes, but also of attempts at care, however rudimentary. Some were allowed to walk in gardens, others given simple tasks to distract the mind. There was no true therapy, but neither was there complete neglect. Attendants, often ill-trained, did what they could. In some places, donations were taken for the care of the poor mad, and visitors might come to see them, not out of compassion, but as a form of grotesque entertainment. Within the noble classes, such institutions were rarely used. Families of rank and wealth preferred discretion. A son who raved might be kept out of sight, tended by private clergy or secluded in a countryside manor. A daughter who withdrew from society might be said to have taken to the faith and quietly entered a convent, whether by choice or decree. Madness among the powerful was a dangerous truth, one that could threaten lineages and alliances, and so it was buried, hidden beneath titles and veils. But perhaps the most striking thing about medieval approaches to mental health was the constant search for meaning. People believed that suffering had purpose, that it was a message, a test, a punishment, or even a path to sainthood. There was dignity sometimes in madness. Holy fools wandered barefoot across Europe, clothed in rags, speaking riddles that were thought to hold divine insight. Pilgrims traveled hundreds of miles to touch a saint's shrine or drink from a healing spring, desperate for clarity or peace. In this world, there was no such thing as meaningless pain. Everything had a reason, even if it could not be seen. And while that belief sometimes led to cruelty, it also provided comfort. A mind in torment was not broken, it was burdened. It was being shaped, like iron in fire, by forces beyond understanding. As the centuries turned and knowledge slowly expanded, ideas began to shift. But in these early chapters of our story, we see a world both dark and gentle. A world trying to care with the tools it had, however imperfect. In the next part, we will explore how madness became entangled with visions and prophecy, how the divine and the disturbed danced together in the candlelight of cathedrals and the loneliness of wilderness paths. Close your eyes now, if they are not already closed, and drift deeper into this world of whispers and wandering minds. The candle's flame flickered against the stone wall of a small chapel, tucked behind the great nave of a cathedral that had stood for generations. In this quiet room, the air was heavy with incense and ancient dust, and the silence pressed in like a thick woolen cloak. It was here that some came not for healing, but for interpretation. For their visions, their voices, their strange dreams. These were not always called illness. Sometimes they were called prophecy. In the medieval world, the line between madness and revelation was delicate, often drawn by context, gender, and power. to speak with spirits, to hear the voice of God, to see signs in the sky. These were gifts or curses, depending on who you were, who you served, and what your words threatened. The same vision that would mark a peasant as mad might earn a noblewoman the title of mystic. Women, in particular, were at the heart of this tangled understanding. Barred from formal religious authority, many found spiritual expression through visions and ecstatic experiences. Some were deeply respected, their writings preserved, and their experiences investigated by bishops and popes. Hildegard of Bingen, for example, was a Benedictine abbess who claimed to receive divine visions from childhood. She described flashes of light, voices from heaven, and a command to write what she saw. Her visions were documented in vivid manuscripts filled with swirling symbols and ethereal figures, seen as revelations, not delusions. But Hildegard was exceptional. For every woman revered as a prophetess, there were many more who whispered their visions to no one, or who were silenced. A baker's wife who claimed to dream of angels might be warned to keep quiet. A shepherdess who said the Virgin Mary spoke to her in the fields might be seen as either blessed or bewitched. It was not only women, of course. Men, too, found themselves caught between holy fire and heretical fear. Some, like the hermits who lived alone in forests or caves, were believed to be closer to God precisely because they had turned their backs on the world. These holy men were thought to see beyond the veil, their minds stripped of earthly distractions. They fasted, they prayed, they slept on stone floors, and some endured visions so intense they trembled for days. But again, their reception depended on interpretation. A hermit who predicted a bountiful harvest might be praised. One who foretold war or famine might be jailed or worse. In these centuries, people lived within a spiritual theater. Signs and portents were everywhere. A comet streaking across the night sky was not a scientific curiosity. It was a warning, a message. Dreams were not random firings of the mind during sleep. They were doorways. To speak of a strange dream was to ask for meaning, and many sought out clergy, monks, or village elders to interpret what their sleeping mind had shown them. And yet, there were those whose visions overwhelmed them. People who cried out in the streets, who tore their clothes or shouted to the sky, not with coherent prophecy, but with words tangled and wild. These were harder to explain. Some were said to be possessed and were brought to the church for exorcism. Others were simply avoided, their suffering too raw, too frightening to behold. But sometimes, amid the confusion and fear, there was awe. A woman who stood motionless in the town square for hours, eyes wide, whispering prayers no one taught her. People might believe she had been touched by the divine. Children were brought to touch her cloak, and some swore they were healed. It didn't matter that her family said she hadn't spoken a full sentence in years. The moment she fit a narrative of sainthood, the suffering of her mind was recast as a miracle. There were tales passed down from generation to generation of men who wandered into the woods and returned with messages from the angels, of women who wept blood and cured the blind. Many of these stories blurred fact and legend, but to those who lived them, the mystery was real. The sacred and the strange were never far apart. Monasteries kept careful records of visions, especially when they came from within their own walls. A monk might record in delicate Latin script the dreams of his brother who saw the end of days, or the Virgin standing in a field of stars. These records served a dual purpose, spiritual inspiration and subtle warning. For in every age, the church was wary of those who claimed direct contact with God. Such visions had to be weighed, tested, examined for orthodoxy. And if they were found wanting, if they diverged from accepted belief, they could be dangerous. There was no consistency, no guarantee. The same vision might be canonized or condemned depending on its content and the mood of the ecclesiastical court. And for those who lived through these experiences, who heard voices or saw things others could not, there was often no way to know how they would be treated until it was too late. Some turned to pilgrimage. Believing their visions to be commands or calls, they walked for miles, across hills, rivers, even countries, to reach holy sites like Santiago de Compostela or Canterbury. These journeys were acts of devotion, but also, at times, acts of desperation. In walking, in suffering, in leaving behind their familiar world, they hoped to find peace, or at least understanding. The roads were dangerous. Pilgrims slept in open fields, begged for food, faced bandits and illness, but they walked all the same, driven by something they could not explain. A voice, a dream, a sense that they were meant for something more than the life they had known. Along the way, they met others, some fervent, some confused, some lost in ways no one could understand. And in these moving tides of humanity, the lines blurred further. Who was mad? Who was holy? Who was simply trying to survive? In many villages, the tale of a visionary lived on long after they were gone. Their names were spoken with reverence or fear, their resting places visited by those seeking miracles. Candles were lit for them, flowers placed on stones that bore no name. And somewhere, deep in the back of a dusty chapel, a monk might still whisper their story over a cup of bitter wine, unsure if he believed it himself. And so, through these flickers of light and shadow, we glimpse a medieval world, both haunted and awed by the mind's mysteries. In the next part, we will venture into the realm of confinement. What happened when the mind could no longer be disguised, when madness was no longer seen as divine, but as something that must be hidden away behind walls and iron locks? Let yourself drift now, like a pilgrim down a moonlit road, uncertain of the path, but guided by something ancient and invisible. The heavy door creaked on its rusted hinges, echoing through the stone corridor like a distant cry. Beyond it lay a room, dimly lit and damp, its walls slick with moss and time. The air was thick with mildew and the faintest trace of candle smoke, long since extinguished. This was not a chapel, nor a healer's chamber. It was something far colder, an oubliette, a place of forgetting. Here, the troubled were not cared for, but concealed. As the Middle Ages deepened, so too did the fear of what could not be explained. Visions once celebrated could become threats. Eccentricities that had drawn reverence were now suspicious. A person whose behavior grew too erratic, whose mind could no longer be stilled by prayer or herbs, was at risk of being cast out, not in the open, but into shadowed confinement. Madness was no longer mysterious. It was dangerous. In the halls of certain castles, behind the hearths and banquet tables, there were rooms not listed in any maps. Small spaces with barred windows or none at all. A noblewoman's brother who screamed in his sleep and wandered the halls at night might vanish into such a room. A lord's daughter once betrothed might be kept hidden after her laughter turned shrill and strange. No word would be spoken, no illness named, only silence and shuttered doors. For the poor, the story was different. They did not have hidden chambers in stone towers or family estates to obscure their suffering. If a commoner's mind began to fray, they were far more exposed. Villagers might try to help at first with whispered prayers or bundles of dried herbs tied to doorposts. But when the strangeness persisted, when the afflicted spoke to no one or everyone, when they became violent or impossibly still, fear would take hold. In some towns, such people were turned over to the local priest. If he deemed them beyond saving, they might be taken to the nearest hospital if one existed. In places like Bedtime in London, or similar institutions in Paris or Milan, they were locked away. These places were often poorly funded, overcrowded, and deeply misunderstood. The staff, though sometimes well-meaning, were ill-prepared. Chains were common. So were cold baths, isolation, and public display. Yes, public display. In the growing cities of late medieval Europe, the mad were sometimes treated as spectacle. Bedlam became infamous for allowing the wealthy to pay to see the inmates, as if they were part of a morbid theater. The broken minds behind iron bars, the shouts and laughter, the vacant stares, these were not seen as cries for help, but as curiosities. The line between entertainment and cruelty blurred in the flickering torchlight. There were no treatments in the modern sense. No real therapy. Care, when it existed, was basic. Food, a blanket, sometimes a prayer. The mad were kept clean if they could not keep themselves so, and when they became too disruptive, they were silenced, muzzled, beaten, or simply forgotten. The walls around them served as both prison and shield, shielding society from their presence and shielding them from a world that no longer knew what to do with them. And yet, not all confinement was cruel. In a few rare places, often far from the cities, small religious communities offered a different kind of isolation. Here, a troubled soul might be taken in not to be hidden, but to be sheltered. Nuns would sit beside a girl who whispered to herself, brushing her hair and humming lullabies. Monks might read softly to an old man who no longer knew his name. These places were rare and fragile, dependent on the compassion of a single abbot or the patience of a quiet sister. But they existed. In their care, madness was not punished, it was witnessed. In the noble courts, madness posed a different problem. It was a threat to inheritance, to power. If a baron grew delusional or paranoid, it could upend alliances, destabilize lands. Whispered accusations of madness could be used as political weapons. Documents would be drawn, witnesses called, and titles stripped under the claim of mental unfitness. The afflicted noble might be sent to a remote manor, cared for by retainers who did not ask questions, or they might disappear entirely. But not all madmen in the court were cast out. Some were kept deliberately as fools. The court jester, often believed to be merely an entertainer, was sometimes a person touched by madness. Their words were strange, their humor sharp and unpredictable, their behavior tolerated because it amused, or because it could be dismissed. In some cases, the jester was the only one who could speak the truth without consequence, hiding piercing insights behind nonsense. It was a dangerous role, but one that gave the appearance of belonging, even in a world of veiled exile. Behind monastery walls, the concept of solitude was reimagined. A monk struggling with his mind might be sent into silence, not as punishment, but as penance. Solitary cells, known as anchor holds, housed not only the devout, but sometimes the disturbed. These were small stone rooms attached to churches, often with a single window facing the altar. The anchorite would remain there for years, sometimes for life, praying, fasting, and seeking God in isolation. For some, it was a calling. For others, it may have been an escape or a burial in stone. These cells were sometimes sealed with ceremony. A funeral mass would be held, symbolizing the death of the self and the rebirth of the soul within those narrow walls. The anchorite would step inside and the door would be closed, often bricked behind them. They would never leave again. Was this holiness or confinement, healing or surrender? The line, as always, was blurred, and outside these places of stone and shadow, life went on. The fields were plowed, the markets bustled, the bells rang for vespers. But somewhere nearby, in a darkened room, someone sat alone, rocking back and forth, listening to voices no one else could hear. Their story might never be told. Their name might be forgotten, but they were there, part of the world, even in their absence. As we move forward in our journey, we will begin to examine how madness and the law began to intertwine. What rights did the mad possess, if any? How were they judged? And how did society's understanding of crime, sin, and illness begin to twist together like vines over an old iron gate? For now, rest. Let the sound of keys turning in locks fade into the distance. Let the stone walls crumble in your dreams. And know that even in the darkest corners, a story waits to be heard. The gavel came down with a dull thud, its sound absorbed by the wooden walls of the town hall. In the dim chamber, lit only by the sun filtering through stained glass and the flicker of tallow candles, a hush settled over the gathering. A man stood before the magistrate, unshaven, trembling, his eyes darting as though he saw things no one else could. The townspeople called him mad. But now, the question was no longer about whispers or pity. It was about guilt and justice. In the medieval world, the law was not blind. It saw with the eyes of theology, superstition, and hierarchy. And when it came to mental illness, or what passed for it in those days, the law struggled to make sense of what it could not grasp. How could one be held responsible for a crime if their mind was not their own? Yet how could society remain safe if the erratic and unpredictable were allowed to roam free? There were no uniform codes of law as we understand them now. Every region had its own customs, its own judges, its own entanglement of feudal, ecclesiastical, and royal decrees. But scattered among these variations was a growing awareness of madness as a legal condition, one that could complicate everything from theft to inheritance. In criminal cases, the mad were often both feared and pitied. If someone committed an act of violence and was known to act strangely, townspeople might cry for mercy or for death, depending on the nature of the crime and the person's reputation. A man who killed in a sudden rage might be said to be touched by the devil. A woman who set fire to her neighbor's barn while speaking in tongues might be seen as a witch or possessed. But what did it mean for the law? Some judges took guidance from canon law. the body of church rules and teachings that govern not just spiritual life, but often civic matters. Within canon law, there was a recognition, vague but present, that people who lacked mental capacity could not sin in the same way as those who knew right from wrong. If the devil had truly taken hold of a person's soul, or if their humors had so overrun their senses that they could not reason, they might be considered less culpable. But the legal system was not gentle. Prisons were harsh places, more akin to holding pens than places of reform. Detainees, mad or sane, were often kept together in crowded cells. Filth, violence, and disease thrived. There were few distinctions and fewer accommodations. A person considered mad might be shackled, chained to a wall, left in the dark for days, not because it was deemed therapeutic, but because there was no other idea of what to do. In some cases, local authorities deferred to the church. A person accused of madness might be examined by a priest who would ask questions in Latin, observe their behavior, and consult theological texts. The verdict might result in exorcism, penance, or banishment. The church had the power to claim the mad as its own concern, and often did so, especially when the crime involved blasphemy, desecration, or strange utterances. But not all madness was criminal. Sometimes it was entangled with property and power. If a nobleman became mentally unwell, it could throw an entire estate into chaos. Who would rule in his stead? Who had the right to his lands, his titles, his taxes? If a lady of the court began speaking to spirits and refused to eat, her family might declare her unfit. But they would have to prove it to a bishop, a council, or even the king. Mental incompetence became a legal tool, not for healing, but for transfer of control. Documents began to emerge, written in Latin or the vernacular, declaring someone non compos mentis, not of sound mind. These declarations were solemn, and their consequences permanent. A person so deemed could not marry, could not testify, could not manage their own affairs. Their identity was placed in the hands of guardians or kin who could act in their name, sometimes with care, sometimes with greed. In one account from the 14th century, a widowed baroness was said to have suffered a sudden change in demeanor after the death of her husband. She stopped speaking, refused food, and wandered the halls at night, clutching his cloak. Her brother petitioned the local court to have her declared insane, citing the need to protect the estate. She was confined to a private chamber. Her lands passed into his hands. Whether she recovered or not, history does not say. For commoners, there were no such formal proceedings. A farmer who could no longer manage his fields might have his land seized by the local lord, under the guise of stewardship. A merchant who ranted in the square might be dragged before the alderman, his goods redistributed, his home taken. There were few protections and no appeals. Madness was a legal vulnerability. But in all this, there was also a strange, silent resistance. In rural villages, among those who had no scrolls or courts, people found their own ways to judge. A woman who spoke to birds and sang under the moon might be fed quietly by her neighbors. A man who wandered barefoot through the hills, muttering to himself, might be called blessed rather than broken. In the eyes of the law, he was a danger, but in the eyes of his kin, he was simply himself. These pockets of understanding, of compassion, were fragile. They depended on memory, familiarity, and patience. They could disappear in a generation or with the arrival of a new priest or magistrate, but they lingered like candlelight in a shuttered room, and the law itself was slowly changing. By the end of the medieval period, as universities grew and new philosophies emerged, ideas of mental capacity began to influence how guilt was assigned, how contracts were written, how society functioned, not because of mercy, but because of order. Madness disrupted the expected patterns of society, and so it had to be categorized, contained, controlled. In our next part, we will turn from the courtrooms and prisons to the spaces of healing once more. We will look more deeply into the physicians and healers who tried to treat the mind, not with chains or scripture, but with observation, with potions, with the earliest stirrings of science. What tools did they have? What did they believe? And what stories were carried in their hands? Close your eyes now. The candle has burned low, and the judge's bench is empty. Let the silence of parchment and stone carry you into sleep, where dreams speak in a language no court could ever truly understand. The physician's hands moved with quiet precision. tracing the rim of a brass bowl filled with dark water and crushed herbs. The scent of wormwood and fennel floated in the air, mingling with the scent of parchment and old sweat. A pale boy sat before him, eyes downcast, lips trembling as though locked in silent conversation with something unseen. The physician did not speak, not yet. He was watching, as all healers had learned to do, watching for the subtle signs that spoke louder than words. In the stillness of medieval medicine, mental illness was not an isolated ailment. It was a thread tangled in the great tapestry of the body, spirit, and stars. To treat the troubled mind, one had to first understand the whole person, their birth, their humors, their sins, their dreams. The healer was part scientist, part priest, part sorcerer, and none of these in full. At the heart of medieval medicine lay the doctrine of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humor corresponded not only to bodily function, but to emotion, behavior, even fate. Too much black bile, the patient might be melancholic, sluggish, depressed. Too much yellow bile, perhaps they were irritable, prone to fits of anger and agitation. The goal of the healer was to restore balance, never to eradicate, but to equalize. For those suffering from what we now recognize as mental illness, treatments ranged from the surprisingly gentle to the deeply disturbing. A melancholic might be given warm baths, calming herbs, or encouraged to walk in gardens filled with rosemary and sage. Physicians believed in the healing power of nature, of silence, of beauty. The sound of water, the rustle of leaves, even the scent of roses was thought to soothe the disordered mind. And yet, balance was not always achieved with kindness. Bloodletting was common, thought to purge the body of excess humors. A leech placed carefully behind the ear, a vein opened with a silver knife at the wrist. The sight of blood, dark and slow-moving, was a sign that the black bile was leaving. The patient might faint. The physician might murmur a prayer. The wound would be wrapped, the room left silent once again. Purgatives and emetics were also used, forcing the body to expel through vomit or stool whatever corruption was believed to dwell inside. A patient with hallucinations might be dosed with hellebore, a powerful and toxic plant that could bring visions or death in equal measure. The line between cure and harm was thin and shifting. Every treatment was a gamble, every recovery a fragile miracle. In cities where universities were rising, Paris, Bologna, Oxford, learned men in robes began to compile texts, theories, observations. They studied the works of Galen, Avicenna, and Hippocrates, writing in Latin by candlelight, arguing about the nature of madness. Was it divine punishment, a disease of the soul, a disorder of the brain? Opinions varied, but always the mind was seen as a reflection of something greater, the cosmos, the creator, the fallibility of man. Astrology played its part as well. The position of the stars at a patient's birth was considered vital in diagnosing ailments. A person born under the influence of Saturn might be predisposed to melancholy. A conjunction of Mars and Mercury could bring madness or genius, or both. Healers consulted celestial charts before prescribing remedies, seeking alignment in the heavens before touching the body. But not all healers wore robes or studied in ivory towers. In villages and forests, hedge witches and cunning folk practiced their own forms of medicine. They knew the herbs that calmed and the mushrooms that brought dreams. They brewed teas from valerian root, wrapped feverish children in linen soaked with chamomile, and whispered over the brow of the grief-stricken. To them, madness was not something to be punished. It was something to be listened to, coaxed out, soothed like a frightened animal. These folk healers often faced suspicion from the church, but their knowledge was old and deeply woven into the fabric of daily life. A grandmother might teach her granddaughter which leaves to chew when anxiety took hold. A father might light a bundle of dried sage over his son's bed when night terrors came. These were acts of love as much as they were medicine. In monasteries, too, there were those who observed the suffering of the mind with care and patience. Monks kept herb gardens, detailed journals, and the occasional miracle record. They brewed tonics from skullcap and lemon balm. They read aloud from the Psalms. They sang in Gregorian tones that resonated with a depth that touched something beneath thought. It was not healing in the clinical sense, but in the sacred one. And sometimes even the act of listening was a form of treatment. There are accounts, rare but striking, of physicians sitting with the afflicted, asking gentle questions. What do you see? What do you hear? What troubles your sleep? The answers may have made little sense to the physicians, but the asking itself, the act of bearing witness, held a kind of medicine. In an age that often silenced the mad, to be heard was extraordinary. Still, many went untreated, not from neglect, but from fear, from ignorance, from the simple limits of knowledge. A man who stood naked in the river and spoke to the wind might be left alone, pitied but untouchable. A woman who wandered the roads humming forgotten songs might be fed but never engaged. Their healing was not attempted, not because they were unloved, but because the tools were not yet there. Medicine was evolving slowly in fragments, and within those fragments were seeds of insight that would take centuries to bloom. In the next part of our journey, we will explore the role of art, music, and ritual, the less formal but deeply human expressions that tried to cradle the troubled mind when logic failed. How did melody soothe the soul? How did sacred theater reflect the torments of the inner world? What stories did communities tell to make sense of sorrow? Let the scent of crushed herbs drift through your dreams now. Let the murmur of old voices reciting forgotten cures guide you into rest. For even in the darkness of unknowing, there was always the flicker of care. In the cold stone chapel, long after the candles had guttered and the monks had returned to their cells, a faint sound lingered, just the whisper of song. Not from a voice, but from memory. It echoed along the walls, like breath caught in the ribs of the building itself. For those who suffered in silence, it was not medicine or logic that eased the pain, but melody. Music, ritual, and art became quiet sanctuaries for the troubled mind, where no words were needed, and understanding flowed not through explanation, but through feeling. In a world where few could read and fewer still could name their pain, art became a mirror. Music, in particular, was seen as a force of both spiritual and physical healing. The tones of Gregorian chant, slow and steady as a heartbeat, filled the air in monasteries across Europe. It was believed that such music could harmonize the soul, align the inner self with divine order. These chants, sung in Latin by cloaked figures, drifted through the sacred hours, matins, lauds, vespers, and wrapped the listener in something ancient and wordless. Those who were troubled, whether by grief, anxiety, or something deeper, were sometimes allowed to sit near the choir, to let the sound pass through them like wind through tall grass. They didn't sing. They didn't have to. Their presence was enough. And in those moments, their stillness was not a symptom, but a kind of participation. Outside the cloistered walls, in village greens and cathedral squares, another kind of healing took place, through performance, color, and myth. Mystery plays and morality tales, performed by guilds and traveling players, retold the great spiritual narratives of the time. They portrayed the battles between virtue and vice, the struggles of the soul, the seductions of despair. Audiences wept, laughed, gasped, and those who carried invisible burdens saw, perhaps for the first time, their own inner torment reflected on stage. In these stories, the mind's suffering became embodied. Sin was a character, temptation wore a mask, despair limped across the boards with tattered robes and hollow eyes, and salvation, radiant and sure-footed, always arrived at the last moment. These plays were not psychological in our modern sense, but they knew something profound, that to name one's sorrow, to give it form, was to begin to understand it. Even among the poorest, there was art. A weaver might stitch patterns into a shawl, not simply for beauty, but to hold meaning. A carver might shape a figurine from driftwood, then place it in a small shrine to protect against nightmares. A mother might paint with berries and ash on the walls of her child's room, symbols passed down through generations meant to soothe and shield. The act of creation itself was a balm. Among the nobility, troubadours and minstrels played lutes and lyres, sang of lost love and distant lands. Their music, while often seen as entertainment, touched the aching places in the soul. A song of longing might speak to the sleepless nobleman pacing his halls at midnight, tormented not by ghosts but by his own restless thoughts. A ballad of betrayal might echo a lady's hidden sorrow as she stitched tapestries with downturned eyes. In these verses, people found resonance, echoes of their own minds rendered in sound and story. Some monasteries recognized this power and preserved instruments alongside their relics, psalteries, rebecks, simple flutes, not for concerts, but for quiet playing. A monk in silent struggle might be encouraged to play a melody rather than speak. A nun, wrestling with the weight of acedia, might sing softly to herself while tending the herb garden. The music was not performance, it was prayer. And then there were the images. In stained glass and illuminated manuscript, the medieval world shimmered with color. Gold leaf halos, deep blue robes, blood-red wounds, each detail told a story. For those suffering in ways they could not explain, to look upon a painted saint, serene amid flames, calm amid beasts, was to be reminded that suffering could have meaning, that torment was not always defeat. Some of the most haunting art of the period came from those who were themselves afflicted. Marginalia, those strange little drawings that crawl along the edges of medieval books, sometimes depicted creatures half human, half beast, monks devouring their own hands, women flying through skies full of daggers. These were not mere decoration. They were expressions, they were cries. The unknown artist, hunched in candlelight, scratching into parchment with trembling fingers, left behind more than images. They left maps of the mind. Ritual, too, held power. Processions for saints' days, blessings of fields and homes, the lighting of candles and long lines down the nave, all these offered structure to minds unraveling. In a world of chaos, ritual brought rhythm. A person who no longer trusted their own thoughts might still trust the steps of a pilgrimage, might still kneel when the bell rang, might still whisper the paternoster with lips that shook. And among families, private rituals bloomed. A father might carve a wooden cross for his daughter to hold during storms. A brother might place a stone under his sister's pillow to ward off night terrors. These acts, small and quiet, were woven into daily life. They were not seen as treatment, but they were anchors. Not everyone found solace. Not everyone heard music as healing or saw beauty in color. For some, the inner storm was too fierce. But even then, there were moments, fleeting as they were, when a song broke through the noise, when a painted face in glass seemed to watch with understanding, when the warmth of candlelight danced just long enough to be remembered. In the next chapter of our story, we will turn toward the lives of caregivers, the quiet hands who bore witness to suffering, who bathed the trembling, who fed the silent, who whispered comfort when no one else dared. Who were these unseen souls, and how did their own hearts survive in the shadow of madness? For now, rest beneath the hum of an invisible hymn. Let it cradle your thoughts as a lullaby once did in childhood. The art of healing was never only in the hands, it was in the voice, in the gaze, in the song that needed no words. She rose before the sun, her feet bare against the cold flagstones, her hands already reaching for the basin of water by the wall. In the dim silence of the infirmary, Sister Eleonora moved like a shadow, careful not to wake the sleepers, some of whom muttered in their dreams, others who had not spoken at all in weeks. She had been here for 30 years, washing the same walls, steeping the same herbs, whispering the same prayers. To those who came in trembling, she was not a nun. She was a lifeline. Caregivers in the Middle Ages lived in the quiet creases of history. They were not written into scrolls or praised from pulpits. They left no signatures, carved no monuments. And yet, day after day, they held the broken together, not by curing, but by remaining. In monasteries and convents, caregiving was seen as service to God. The Benedictine rule, followed by countless communities across Europe, instructed monks and nuns to receive the sick as they would receive Christ himself. Care for the weak, it said, with all tenderness. For those suffering from afflictions of the mind, that tenderness might be the only thing left. These caregivers were often women. Though barred from higher ecclesiastical power, nuns wielded authority within the walls of their cloisters. They brewed teas from lemon balm and rue. They prepared soft bread for those who refused to eat. They sat through the long hours of silence beside a weeping girl who could not say why she wept. They did not demand explanations. They were not always afraid. They knew the signs, the sudden quiet after days of panic, the way the eyes focused just over one's shoulder, as if someone stood there who couldn't be seen. They knew when to approach and when to leave the room. They knew which prayers to murmur when words failed. In some cases, it was the nuns themselves who suffered. Cloistered life could be a haven for women whose minds strained against the world. Within those stone walls, eccentricity was more easily forgiven. Visions could be recorded, rather than punished. A woman who struggled with moods too heavy for daily life might be considered deep in contemplation. A nun who wept at odd hours might be said to have the gift of divine sorrow. The cloister did not erase suffering, but it allowed it to exist within a framework that protected it from harsher judgment. Outside the religious orders, care was more precarious. In small villages, it fell to family, mothers, sisters, even neighbors, to tend to those who had slipped into shadow. A mother might feed her son by hand each night, though he no longer spoke her name. A husband might build a locked enclosure behind the house to keep his wife from wandering, convinced that the spirits who visited her at night were calling her to the woods. These actions were born not of cruelty, but of desperation. They had no manuals, no guidance, only love and fear. And often there were those few in each community, the midwife, the old widower, the herbalist, who took on the role of caregiver by quiet consensus. They were the ones people turned to when a child began muttering to themselves, or when a neighbor refused to leave her bed. Their care was simple, direct, a warm cloth, a song hummed over soup, a talisman left on a windowsill. It wasn't science, but it was something. In towns and cities, the picture was more complex. Institutions like Bedtime did employ attendants, but many were poorly trained, and their care was often driven by routine more than compassion. Yet even here, there were exceptions. A washerwoman who paused to braid a patient's hair, a porter who left an extra crust of bread on a windowsill. These small acts, unwritten and unseen, became moments of grace in places otherwise forgotten by mercy. There were also healers, wandering or rooted, who gave their lives to this work. Not scholars, not clergy, but ordinary people who believed that madness could be soothed. They often paid a price. Their association with the mad cast suspicion. Some were accused of witchcraft or of harboring evil. Others simply faded into obscurity, their work deemed unimportant. But the suffering left marks on the caregivers too. Sister Eleonora once tended to a young woman who believed her body was full of birds. She wouldn't sleep indoors, afraid they would die without sky. For weeks, Eleonora brought her warm food in the cloister garden and sang to her in the early morning when the air was still silver with dew. Then one morning, the girl did not rise. She had curled under the statue of St. Francis, her eyes wide and still. Eleonora sat beside her for an hour before calling the others. She never told them what the girl had whispered to her the night before. The birds are flying home. That grief never left her. She carried it the way others carried rosary beads, quietly, always within reach. Caregivers in this world were not saviors. They had no potions to restore reason, no cures to undo the unraveling of a mind. But they stayed. They touched the fevered forehead. They brushed the hair back from the eyes. They whispered into silence, "You are not alone." In the next part of our journey, we will step into the world of the afflicted themselves, what they may have felt, thought, remembered, not as case studies, but as people. What was it like to live in a world that feared your dreams, to hear voices when no one else did, to be both human and ghost among the living? But for now, sleep. Let your mind rest in the soft arms of those long gone, whose care left no record but echoes. Let them watch over your dreams as they once watched over the broken, one quiet breath at a time. She sat at the edge of the field, her hands buried in the soil. The wind tugged at her cloak, and her eyes remained fixed on the horizon, though nothing moved there. Around her, the village hummed with its quiet rhythm. Children chasing hens, men carting firewood, the occasional bell ring in the distance. But she heard none of it. Her world was wrapped in a deeper silence, pierced only by voices no one else could hear. To understand mental illness in the Middle Ages, one must step beyond the words of monks and the tools of physicians. One must try, gently, to step inside the mind of the afflicted themselves, to imagine not what others saw, but what was felt deep within. And while we can never know for certain, there are whispers in the margins of manuscripts, in the confessions of saints, and in the trembling script of letters never sent. Through them, we can glimpse the shadows. Imagine waking each day unsure of the world's shape, sometimes clear, sometimes dreamlike. The sky might look too bright, the trees too close. The words of your neighbors twist strangely, like water running backwards. You try to explain, but your mouth betrays you. The words come wrong, or worse, they come out in a rush, wild, urgent, filled with truths that others don't want to hear. They call you touched, or cursed, or worse. And so you learn to stay quiet. The weight of the mind's unraveling does not arrive all at once. It drips in slowly, through dreams that disturb, through long nights when sleep will not come, through the subtle changes in your own reflection. You are still yourself, but not. Still in your body, but watching from a little distance, as if the world has softened at the edges. For some, it begins with voices. Not loud, not at first. Just a whisper, like someone calling your name from another room. You look, but no one is there. Then the whisper grows bolder, takes shape. Sometimes it's a comfort, a friend. Sometimes it's cruel, accusing, mocking. The line between thought and voice begins to blur. And when you finally speak of it, people step back. They might pray for you. They might shun you. They might tie rosemary in your hair or lead you to the chapel. But they will not understand, not truly. For others, it is not voices but dread, an ache in the chest that never leaves, a fear of things you cannot name, of thresholds, of windows, of your own hands. You might wake in the night and feel the urge to walk, not knowing where you are going, only that you cannot remain. And when you return, they ask you where you've been. You cannot answer. You were lost inside yourself. In some cases, there is joy, too much of it, a giddiness that will not fade. You sing for hours. You dance when no one watches. You feel as though God has spoken directly into your heart and filled it with fire. You are radiant, and for a moment, you believe you are chosen. But when you try to share it, they look at you with pity or fear. Then the joy turns. The fire becomes smoke. The brilliance fades into shadows, and you are left wondering what part of it was ever real. The hardest part is not always the pain. It is the loneliness. To live with a mind in turmoil is to walk a road few others can follow. Even the kindest faces begin to blur. You hear them speaking of you in the past tense. She used to be so clever. He was always quiet, but not like this. They stop meeting your eyes. They stop touching your shoulder. You become something between person and ghost. And yet not every moment is suffering. There are times when the world opens in a strange and beautiful way, when the colors of the forest shimmer like stained glass, when the rhythm of your breath matches the wind, and for a brief instant, everything makes sense. You might speak to birds and believe they understand. You might see meaning in the way the leaves fall, in the shape of clouds, in the sound of footsteps on stone. These moments are fleeting, but they are real as anything else. There are also moments of fierce clarity, when you understand more deeply than ever before how fragile everything is, how close we all are to falling. You see the cracks in the world, the tremble behind every smile. You want to warn people, to protect them, but they call it madness. Some, in desperation, walk away. They leave their homes, their families, their names. They wander the roads, the forests, the ruins. They are not running, they are searching for peace, for silence, for a place where they can exist without explanation. Some find it in monasteries, some find it in the wilderness, others never find it at all. And yet through all of this, there is something unbroken within, a small, silent core that remains untouched. Even as the mind twists and storms, there is a part that watches, that remembers, that hopes. It is easy to see the afflicted as broken, but they are not. They are travelers in a landscape most fear to enter. Their journey is not one of failure, but of endurance. To wake each day with a mind that does not behave and still breathe, still walk, still try, that is a kind of courage no one writes songs about, but should. In the next part, we will return to the great cathedrals and dusty chapels to examine how saints and sinners alike were shaped by stories of madness. We will look at how the holy and the heretic sometimes shared the same visions, and how the church wrestled with the mystery of the mind. But for now, let your thoughts drift like mist across an old meadow. Let the voices quiet, the colors soften. There is no need to explain, only to rest. The air inside the cathedral was thick with the scent of beeswax and myrrh, flickering gold from 1,000 candles reflecting off the smooth marble of saints' faces. Pilgrims knelt beneath stained glass windows, eyes lifted toward images of agony and ecstasy. Saints pierced by swords, saints bathed in light, saints lost in trances no mortal could understand. Here in the heart of faith, madness wore many masks, sometimes divine, sometimes damned. Throughout the medieval world, The church stood as both shepherd and judge in matters of the soul, and by extension, the mind. It held authority not only over confession and salvation, but over interpretation. And it was within this power that the church wrestled with a profound dilemma: how to tell the difference between madness and miracle. Many saints throughout history exhibited what we now recognize as signs of psychological disturbance. They heard voices, they fasted until near death, they wept uncontrollably, laughed without cause, predicted disasters, and wandered through forests speaking to unseen companions, and yet they were canonized. Their suffering was framed not as disorder, but as divine intimacy. Saint Catherine of Siena claimed to have mystical visions from the age of 6. She refused to eat except for the Eucharist, and would often fall into trances that lasted hours, even days. Her writings described ecstatic conversations with Christ, and she reportedly bore the invisible stigmata, wounds mirroring those of the crucified Jesus. To the church, these were signs of holiness. To a modern eye, they might also suggest episodes of dissociation or psychosis. But in the Middle Ages, Catherine's experiences elevated her, made her a vessel of the sacred. She was not alone. Saint Teresa of Avila, Saint Francis of Assisi, and Saint Hildegard of Bingen each spoke of visions and voices that guided their lives. In a world so deeply embedded in faith, such experiences were not questioned if they led to acts of piety and submission to church doctrine. It was not the vision itself that made one holy, it was what one did with it. This is where the line began to fray. For every Catherine or Francis, there were many more who claimed visions and were not believed. Their words did not echo what the church wished to hear. Their prophecies threatened order, their voices came at the wrong time, from the wrong mouths. A peasant girl who claimed to speak with angels might be condemned as possessed. A monk who withdrew from the world and cried out in Latin might be praised or exiled. A woman who heard voices urging rebellion might be led to the stake. Joan of Arc stood at this boundary like a flame. She claimed to hear the voices of saints, Michael, Catherine, Margaret, who instructed her to lead the French against the English. She wore armor, she carried a banner, she inspired armies, and for a time the church watched, uneasy but silent. But when she was captured, when her cause threatened the balance of power, the same church that once stood beside her turned cold. Her voices were reinterpreted. Not sacred but demonic, not divine guidance but heresy. She was tried, she was burned. After her death, the church reevaluated, she was canonized. Her madness, once condemned, was recast as sainthood. But for Joan, the flames had already claimed her body. It was not only visionaries who faced such scrutiny. Those who suffered in quieter ways, deep melancholy, inexplicable rage, long silences, were also filtered through the lens of faith. If one's suffering led to humility, prayer, and obedience, it could be seen as purification, a trial from God. But if it led to disobedience, erratic behavior, or questioning of authority, it was a threat. Exorcisms were one response. Conducted by priests trained in the rites, they were meant to drive out demons believed to inhabit the mind and body. These rituals were intense, filled with Latin chants, holy water, relics, and physical force. The afflicted might scream, convulse, tear at their skin. To witnesses, this was proof of possession. To the afflicted, it was terror cloaked in piety. Yet there were moments, even in these rites, of something softer. Some priests approached the task not as warriors, but as shepherds. They would pray beside the afflicted for hours, weep with them, listen. In these moments, the exorcism became less about battle and more about recognition, about telling someone, in the language of their time, that their pain was real and deserved response. Monasteries kept records of such cases, scrolls filled with accounts of demonic oppression, spiritual affliction, inexplicable sorrow. Some described miraculous recoveries. Others ended in silence. These documents, written in steady script by candlelight, were part theology, part medicine, part journal. They were attempts to understand the unknowable. And in the heart of every cathedral, where saints gazed down in radiant stillness, the people brought their mad to kneel. They came with daughters who hadn't spoken in months, with sons who screamed at phantoms, with wives who wept through the night. They lit candles, they placed coins in alms boxes. They prayed, desperate for a cure. Sometimes they saw change, sometimes they did not. But they returned again and again. because the church was the one place where suffering could be sanctified. In the next part of our journey, we will drift into the realm of superstition and folk belief, how the common people interpreted madness not through theology or medicine, but through the old stories, the spirits, the omens, the tales whispered around hearths after dark. But for now, let the saints keep vigil in the candlelight of your dreams. Let their silent eyes remind you that suffering in all its forms was never truly unseen. The hearth fire crackled low, casting flickering shadows on the cottage walls as the old woman stirred her pot of herbs. Outside, the forest breathed in moonlight, and owls called to one another across the dark canopy. Inside, a girl sat by the fire, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes wide with fear. She had seen something, something no one else could see, and so they had brought her here, not to a priest, not to a physician, but to the wise woman who lived at the edge of the village, where the trees grew thick and the world grew strange. In the deep folds of medieval life, beyond the watchful eye of the church and the cold logic of the university, there thrived another world, a world of folk belief, of superstition, of ancestral wisdom passed down not through parchment but through whispers. This world understood madness not as illness, not as sin, but as enchantment, possession, or curse. And in many ways it was more accepting, though not always more kind. To be mad, in the language of the folk, was often to be touched by spirits, touched by fae, touched by something ancient and unseen. A child who laughed at nothing, who wandered too far into the woods and returned changed, quieter, paler, eyes unfocused, might be called a changeling. The fair folk, it was said, had stolen the real child and left behind something else. This belief, rooted in Celtic and Germanic traditions, persisted in many rural regions. Mothers would place iron scissors near the cradle or hang rosemary over the door to protect their infants from being taken. If the change came anyway, they did not see it as madness. They saw it as magic gone wrong. Those who spoke in strange tongues, who danced under the moonlight, who seemed to know things they shouldn't, might be thought to be witches or cursed by one. The line between seer and sorcerer was thin. A woman might be revered in one village and reviled in the next, her knowledge feared as much as it was needed. And so, for the afflicted, the first stop was often not a doctor or a priest, but someone like the old woman by the fire, called by many names: hedge witch, cunning woman, herb wife, wise one. She would listen. She would brew potions of valerian, skullcap, and wild thyme. She might pass a candle 3 times over the sufferer's head and murmur charms in a language half lost to time. She would anoint foreheads with oil, bury tokens at crossroads, scatter salt at thresholds. These rituals were not medicine as we know it, but they were acts of meaning, of care, and often of deep psychological power. Sometimes she would perform a drawing out ritual, meant to pull the affliction from the body. A string might be tied around the wrist of the afflicted, knotted with 9 knots as she spoke, or a charm might be written on parchment and burned, the ashes mixed into water and sipped under starlight. The belief was not in chemical reaction, but in balance, in restoring what had been broken in the soul's alignment with the natural world. And yet, folk belief could also be cruel. If someone's madness frightened too many, if their behavior grew violent or too strange, fear could turn to anger. A man who claimed to see omens in smoke might be accused of consorting with demons. A woman who predicted a death that later came to pass might be seized as a witch. A child who could not speak, who rocked back and forth for hours, might be drowned to drive out the spirit said to inhabit them. Superstition is not mercy. It is not medicine. It is fear disguised as explanation. But still, in these folkways, there was a truth often ignored by scholars and priests, that the mind and the world are not separate, that what we call madness might sometimes be a response to a world that does not make sense, that perhaps the trees do speak in their own way, that perhaps the night carries more than darkness. Communities often had their own codes. In one village, a madman might be given a specific role, keeper of the town's oldest stories, or the one who led springtime rituals with branches and bells. In another, he might be kept in a locked room, visited only by family. Some believed the mad had second sight. Others feared they could call down curses. All believed they stood slightly apart, in a liminal space between the human and the other. And for the afflicted themselves, these beliefs shaped identity. To be told you were cursed is not the same as being told you are sick. One implies wrongdoing, the other, imbalance. For some, the label of enchantment brought comfort. It gave their suffering a name. It gave them a place in the great entangled story of the world, a story filled with spirits, omens, ancient rules. They were not broken. They were chosen. Even the seasons played a role in these beliefs. Madness was said to rise in spring, when the sap of the trees flowed fast and the world came awake too quickly. In winter, the long nights were feared, times when the mind could lose itself in silence. The cycles of the earth mirrored the cycles of the self. And so, year after year, the rituals repeated. The charms were whispered, the herbs were gathered beneath full moons. The afflicted were soothed, or feared, or forgotten, but they were never meaningless. In the next part of our journey, we will enter the dark corridors of early asylums, not the institutions of later centuries, but the first places designed not just to house, but to manage and observe those deemed insane. We will see how architecture itself began to shape the treatment of the mind, and how bricks and doors became symbols of both safety and confinement. But for now, let the forest grow quiet. Let the old woman finish her song. Let the girl by the fire fall into a deep and dreamless sleep. For even in a world ruled by shadow and superstition, there were moments when care slipped through, soft as ash on the wind. The key turned slowly in the iron lock, groaning like something ancient awakening. The heavy wooden door creaked open, and the smell of damp stone and stale air drifted outward into the corridor. A monk stepped inside, holding a lamp that cast a trembling glow on the room's interior. Bare walls, a straw mattress, a single wooden stool. In the far corner, a figure sat silently, knees drawn to chest, eyes wide but distant. He did not speak. He had not spoken in days. This was not a home, nor a place of healing. This was an early asylum. Though the term asylum would not become widely used until later centuries, its roots began here in the medieval world. In monasteries, hospitals, and later, in dedicated institutions, the idea began to take hold that the mad, the deeply troubled, the unpredictable, the lost, needed not only spiritual or medical attention, but containment. What began as care quietly shifted toward control. In the early centuries, those with mental afflictions might be sheltered within monasteries or religious hospitals, cared for alongside the sick and the poor. Some of these institutions, like the famed Hospital of St. Mary of Bethlehem in London, later known as Bedtime, began to take in individuals specifically noted for strange or violent behavior. What began as charity hardened over time into separation. Rooms were built with thicker walls, doors reinforced with iron, windows placed high and small, too narrow for escape, admitting only the barest sliver of light. The design of these spaces reflected the growing belief that mental illness was something dangerous, something that needed to be watched, measured, and above all, kept away. It was not only for the protection of the afflicted, but for the protection of society. Fear had grown. Tales of sudden violence, of unpredictable behavior, of people wandering naked through marketplaces or screaming hymns at midnight. These tales spread faster than the truth. Madness, once considered a spiritual burden or mystical calling, began to take on the color of threat. The walls rose in response. Inside these early asylums, care was often minimal. Beds of straw, meals of broth or bread, and little else. Cleanliness was inconsistent. Silence was encouraged, even enforced. Those who could not be quiet were sometimes restrained by rope, chain, or even the architecture itself. Rooms designed for echo and emptiness meant to wear down resistance. And yet, amid the harshness, flickers of humanity still appeared. A nurse might bring a warm stone wrapped in linen to ease aching joints. A monk might recite psalms to a man who no longer remembered his name. A visiting sister might leave behind a sprig of lavender tucked beneath the corner of a blanket. These acts were small, but they mattered. They marked the line between punishment and presence. Some institutions developed rudimentary forms of observation. A record might be kept of a patient's behavior, how often they ate, when they spoke, what they said. These were not for research, but for order. Yet in these early notes, we see the first glimmers of what would become psychology centuries later. The desire to understand patterns, to name the invisible. But not all were so fortunate. In some places, particularly where funding was scarce or attitudes harsh, The afflicted were treated with cruelty, locked in basements, exposed to the elements, displayed even to the curious public. Bedlam, in particular, became notorious in later years for allowing visitors to peer into cells for a fee. The suffering became spectacle. The afflicted became exhibits. These early asylums reflected a broader change in how society viewed mental illness. The mad were no longer simply part of the community, tended by families, soothed by rituals. They were now something to be managed, isolated, and corrected. It was a shift from intimacy to institutionalization. The architecture itself became metaphor. Tall walls, thick doors, narrow windows, all suggested containment, not communication. Those inside were not expected to recover, but to be quiet, to disappear. And yet, through these barriers, the human soul still stirred. Some patients painted on walls with soot or blood, drawing patterns, faces, symbols. Others hummed songs from childhood, over and over like spells. A few carved marks into the wooden beams of their beds, tallies, prayers, or simply a way to remember that they had lived another day. These small rebellions were not acts of defiance, but of self-preservation. Even in confinement, the mind reached outward, and for some, the silence brought clarity. There are records, fragile and scattered, of individuals who after months in solitude began to speak again, to weep, to ask for parchment or confession. A woman once believed lost to madness entirely emerged from her cell during Easter Mass and recited a verse from the book of John, her voice calm, her eyes steady. Was it healing? A miracle? Or simply the slow turning of the soul, like earth beneath snow? These places did not promise recovery. They promised removal. But within them, lives still unfolded, day by day, heartbeat by heartbeat. In the next part of our journey, we will explore the role of madness in medieval literature and myth, how stories of the mad were told and retold, not as footnotes, but as central figures. Kings who fell to grief, knights who lost their minds in war, lovers driven mad by sorrow. What do these tales reveal about the fears and hopes of the age? But for now, let the door close softly, let the echoes fade, let the figure in the corner rest in the quiet hum of darkness, not gone, not broken, just waiting. The wind moaned through the stone corridors of an old castle, carrying with it the scent of rain and moss. In the upper tower, a scribe bent over his manuscript, the tip of his quill trembling above a sheet of vellum. He had just written the word madness. It was not a diagnosis, not even a condemnation. It was the beginning of a story, one of many. In the Middle Ages, tales of madness were stitched into the fabric of storytelling like threads of silver and shadow. Madness was not a sideline affliction. It was a fate, a symbol, a transformation. It appeared in the cries of grieving kings, the wanderings of disgraced knights, and the sorrows of star-crossed lovers. In literature and myth, madness became a mirror, not just of the mind, but of the soul. It was not always feared. Sometimes it was sacred. Take, for instance, the tale of the Mad King. In many medieval romances and chronicles, monarchs were portrayed as wise and just until grief unseated their reason. A king loses his beloved queen and retreats into silence. He forgets his duties, speaks in riddles, wanders the palace at night calling her name. His counselors whisper of demons. His people pray. And yet the story does not end in scorn. Often his sorrow is seen as noble, his madness a sign of the depth of his love. He is tragic, not monstrous. In the tale of King Lear, a legend with older roots than Shakespeare's pen, the aging monarch divides his kingdom unwisely and is cast out by his daughters. As his world unravels, so too does his mind. He rages against storms, speaks to spirits, and weeps on the heat. But in the heart of his madness, Lear begins to understand things he never could when crowned. Madness becomes clarity. This idea that madness brings insight echoes through many stories. The mad fool was often a holy figure in disguise. In chivalric romances, the fool speaks in nonsense, dances through court with bells on his tunic, and yet he alone can name the truth. He sees what the proud cannot. He touches what the pious will not. Madness here becomes a key to wisdom, a language only the desperate can speak. Consider the wild man of medieval myth, the solitary figure covered in hair and leaves, who lives at the edge of civilization. He has lost speech, forgotten his name, but gained something else, a connection to nature, to purity, to raw and untamed power. Knights who encounter him are often changed, taught, or tested. He is feared, yes, but also revered. These characters spoke to a deep part of the medieval mind, a part that recognized the instability of the world. War, plague, famine, betrayal, all could shatter a person. Madness in these tales was not weakness. It was the price of living with a heart too open, a soul too burdened. And in the stories of love, madness became almost inevitable. There are poems of noble women who, abandoned by their lovers, go mad with grief. They wander the hills in white, singing to no one, cradling invisible infants, plucking at flowers until their fingers bleed. There are knights who, believing their beloved dead, cast off their armor and run wild through the woods, forgetting language, fearing mirrors, living like beasts. They are called mad, but not pitied. They are envied in a way, for loving so deeply that the world itself could no longer contain them. In Arthurian legend, we find Sir Lancelot torn between loyalty to his king and love for Guinevere. When their affair is exposed, he flees. There are versions of the tale in which he descends into madness, hiding in the forest, reduced to rags and prayers. But even in his lowest moments, Lancelot remains noble. His madness does not unmake him. It reveals his humanity. Even saints in hagiographies exhibit signs of divine madness. They cry out in ecstasy, starve themselves, strip naked in public as symbols of humility. Saint Francis of Assisi was seen as mad when he renounced his father's wealth and embraced a life of poverty and preaching to animals. But in his madness, people saw holiness. His rejection of worldly logic became proof of divine purpose. It is no wonder that stories of madness were so beloved. They offered explanation, redemption. They told listeners that their own grief, confusion, and despair were not unique, and more than that, not shameful. They were part of the story, part of what it meant to be alive in a world so full of uncertainty. In castles and cottages alike, such stories were told by candlelight, passed down through generations, embroidered into tapestries, painted into manuscripts, carved into the stone of cathedrals and choir stalls. The madman, the madwoman, the fool, the seer, the wild one, they all had their place. Of course, not all stories were kind. There were also tales meant to warn, to frighten, of mad women luring men into bogs, of witches driven mad by power, their laughter echoing through the trees, of cursed children who grew teeth in the womb and eyes on their backs. These were darker shadows, but even they held meaning. They gave shape to fear. They made the unknown a little more bearable. Literature, after all, is the mind dreaming aloud. And in the Middle Ages, those dreams were full of madness. In our next chapter, we will look toward the body itself, how mental illness was written on the flesh, and how the medieval world read these signs. What did they see in tremors, in stigmata, in silence? How did the body betray the mind or try to save it? But for now, let the stories rest. Let the mad kings and weeping knights return to their pages. Let the wild women sleep beneath the yew trees. Their stories are not over, but tonight they are quiet. The fire had burned low in the infirmary hearth. Only embers remained, glowing faintly like watchful eyes in the dark. A monk sat beside the bed of a patient who had not spoken in days. The man's body was thin, too thin, his skin pale and drawn tightly over his bones. But it was not illness of the lungs or blood that brought him here. It was silence, long, unbroken silence, and the way his hands trembled without cause, the way he stared at nothing, as though waiting for someone no one else could see. In the medieval mind, the body was not separate from the soul, nor the mind. It was one part of a holy, mysterious whole. When the mind faltered, the body often bore the signs. And so caregivers and physicians alike look for these signs, not just in behavior, but in flesh and form. They believed the body could speak, even when the mouth did not. They watched closely, interpreting every tremor, every wound, every cry as a message waiting to be read. A trembling hand might be called a sign of divine possession or of hysteria. A vacant stare could be the mark of melancholia or the result of demonic influence. If a person scratched at their skin until it bled, it might be seen as an attempt to purge themselves of sin or as a physical manifestation of inner torment. Medieval thought did not separate the seen from the unseen. They were mirrors of one another. And so, the body became a canvas on which madness was written. Perhaps the most visible example of this belief came in the form of the stigmata, wounds that appeared on the bodies of certain saints and mystics, mirroring the crucifixion wounds of Christ. These wounds, often bleeding without visible cause, were interpreted as signs of divine favor. But beneath the reverence, there was also unease. Were these wounds miraculous? Or were they born of a suffering mind that could not bear the weight of its own devotion? Saint Francis of Assisi was the first recorded stigmatic in Christian history. The marks appeared on his hands, feet, and side after a vision of a seraph on a cross. He bore them for the rest of his life. To his followers, they were proof of his sanctity. But others whispered that such things could not be entirely holy, that perhaps the mind, through ecstasy and fervent prayer, had summoned them forth. Wounds of the soul turned outward. Other saints, Saint Catherine of Siena, Saint Rita of Cascia, were said to have borne similar signs. Their suffering was visible, their holiness written in blood. And yet for the unknown, the unnamed, the ordinary, such wounds were not always sanctified. A woman who bled mysteriously might be seen not as holy, but as cursed. A man who starved himself might not be venerated, but confined. It mattered deeply who you were, and who believed your pain had meaning. Fasting, too, was a common expression of spiritual and psychological suffering. Holy anorexia, as it would later be called, appeared in many female mystics who refused food for days, even weeks, claiming that only the body of Christ sustained them. To the church, this could be seen as piety of the highest order. But beneath the holiness lay anguish, control, fear, obsession. The hunger was real, but it was not always for God. In other cases, madness showed itself through the skin. Boils, bruises, sores that would not heal. Some believed these were signs of inner sin, of spiritual rot made visible. Others saw them as afflictions visited by demons, punishments for heresy or unspoken wickedness. A rash could condemn a person if it appeared at the wrong time, in the wrong place, before the wrong eyes. The voice, too, became a battleground. Some afflicted screamed for hours, their cries echoing through stone halls until even the birds fell silent. Others lost their voice entirely. They became mute, not through injury, but through trauma or inner collapse. The sudden absence of speech was as frightening to medieval observers as any frenzy. To be silent utterly and inexplicably was to be removed from the world. There are records of those who howled like wolves, barked like dogs, or spoke in languages unknown. These behaviors were written down with awe and fear, and often interpreted as signs of possession or divine punishment. The body, in its strangeness, was proof of mystery, and in a time without science as we know it, mystery demanded explanation. One woman, recorded in a monastery ledger, plucked out her hair strand by strand, claiming that her thoughts were tangled in it. Another tore at her robes, saying that they burned like fire, though no one else could feel the heat. A man wandered naked through the snow, reciting psalms, unaware that his feet were bleeding. These were not performances. They were expressions of pain too large for words, of minds cracking under burdens no one could see. Even posture was studied. A hunched back could be a sign of submission or shame. Constant kneeling might be seen as penitence or obsession. Those who stood too straight, too still, were sometimes feared more than those who raged. What did they know, people wondered, that made them so quiet? In a world where few could read or write, the body was the first and last text. It was watched by priests, feared by villagers, recorded by physicians, and prayed over by mothers. Its wounds told stories. Its silences echoed louder than bells. And in the solitude of night, when the body could no longer pretend, it trembled. It sobbed. It bled. And somewhere, someone lit a candle and whispered a prayer, not knowing whether they prayed for healing or simply understanding. In the next chapter, we will travel outward, to the margins of the medieval world, to those who lived outside the gates, outside the law, outside even the faint comfort of diagnosis, the mad who were exiled, who wandered, who became legend. But tonight, let the body rest, let the hands be still, let the old wounds close just for a while, for even flesh needs mercy, and the soul a place to hide. The road wound through the hills like a thread lost between folds of fabric, fading into mist where it dipped into the forest. Along its edge, a figure moved slowly, wrapped in a tattered cloak, barefoot despite the frost. No name followed him. No family called him home. He spoke to the birds, to the trees, to the stones beneath his feet. Some called him mad, others called him cursed. A few called him holy, but no one called him by his name. It had been forgotten long ago. In the margins of the medieval world, where records ran thin and the gaze of church and crown grew dim, the mad often walked alone. Cast out from their homes, their villages, their lives, they became wanderers. Nomads of the spirit, ghosts before death. Exile was not always formal. There were no grand declarations, no trumpets. Sometimes it was a simple decision whispered behind closed doors. A brother who stopped opening the door, a priest who advised distance, a village that grew too quiet when the afflicted walked past. A person could leave not because they were forced, but because there was no space left for them to stay. And so they went to the edges, to the forests, where the trees offered shadow and silence, to the ruins of old Roman buildings, where moss covered the stones and the wind made no judgments, to the hills, the caves, the stretches of empty land between towns where no one asked questions. These places became both prison and refuge. Among the exiled, there were many kinds. Some were quiet, broken by grief or confusion, their minds wrapped tightly around memories they could not escape. They wandered with pockets full of pebbles or sang lullabies to no one. They lived off scraps, slept beneath hedges, stared at the moon until their eyes watered. Villagers sometimes left food near the road for them, wrapped in linen or tucked beneath stones. It was a wordless kindness. Others were loud, howling their visions to the sky, shaking their fists at unseen enemies, shouting sermons that only they could understand. These were the ones children were warned about, the ones said to bring misfortune, yet even they had moments of clarity, of tenderness. A woman who shrieked all day might fall silent at sunset to watch the birds gather. A man who cursed the wind might weep at the sight of a flower growing through a crack in the stone. And then there were those who became legend. In some regions, stories were told of mad wanderers who possessed secret knowledge. A man who lived in the woods and could cure fevers with a glance. A woman who walked backward along the road and spoke in riddles that foretold the future. These figures straddled the line between madness and magic. They were feared, yes, but also respected. A traveler might seek them out, trembling with uncertainty, to ask about a lost child or a dying cow. The mad one would answer in cryptic phrases, drawing signs in the dirt, and the traveler would return home both terrified and grateful. For in a world filled with uncertainty, even madness could offer clarity. In some cases, the exiled mad were adopted by outlaws, beggars, or wandering performers. The road has always made strange companions. A troupe of minstrels might keep a quiet boy who never spoke but played the flute beautifully. A band of vagabonds might protect a woman who screamed at night but could find clean water where others could not. Among the rejected, new families sometimes formed, fragile, shifting, but real. The seasons ruled their lives. In summer, they slept beneath trees, ate wild berries, and followed the roads worn by pilgrims. In winter, they dug into snowbanks, hid in abandoned chapels, and wrapped themselves in stolen cloth. Many did not survive the cold. Their bones were found in spring, curled beneath roots or half buried in river mud. No prayers marked their passing. No stones bore their names. But even in their solitude, they were not forgotten. Songs were sung about the wild man in the glen who danced with foxes. Tales were told of the silent woman on the cliff who waited for the sea to speak her name. These stories traveled farther than the people who inspired them. They passed through generations, embroidered with awe and sorrow, growing softer at the edges with time. Not all who wandered were mad, and not all the mad were cast out. But for those who were, who found themselves beyond the reach of care, love, or even fear, the world narrowed into a long and endless path. They became part of the land, part of the wind, part of the story. And sometimes, when a child went missing, or a stranger came to town speaking strange truths, people would glance toward the hills and wonder, had the wanderer passed this way? Had the ghost of madness walked through their fields again? In the next part of our journey, we will return to the heart of the church once more, to explore the curious role of relics, pilgrimage, and sacred sites in the medieval response to mental illness. What power was believed to lie in a saint's bone? What healing waited at the end of a long and perilous road? But for now, listen to the wind as it moves through the trees. It carries the footsteps of those long forgotten, those who walk the edge of the world with nothing but a tattered cloak and a mind full of stars. Let them pass gently through your dreams. The road to Canterbury shimmered beneath the morning mist. worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, some purposeful, others desperate. A woman limped slowly along the path, clutching a bundle wrapped in linen against her chest. Her lips moved in silent prayer, though her eyes were wide and unfocused, seeing something beyond the hedgerows and distant steeples. She was not alone. Pilgrims dotted the horizon, bound for holy places where healing, it was said, waited like a gift wrapped in sunlight. Among them were many like her, troubled, touched, mad. In the medieval world, pilgrimage was not only a journey of faith, it was a path of hope for the afflicted, especially those suffering in the mind. When no priest could cast out the torment, no herb quiet the voices, no family bear the weight of unrelenting sorrow, there remained the road, and at its end, a miracle. Holy sites across Europe became magnets for the suffering. Shrines, relics, and wells were visited not just by the devout, but by those desperate for something, anything, that might pull them back from the edge. And while the church offered guidance, it was often the belief of the people that gave these places power. Saint Dymphna's shrine in Geel, in what is now Belgium, became one such destination. According to legend, Dymphna was the daughter of a pagan king who, maddened by grief after his wife's death, desired to marry his daughter because she resembled her mother. Dymphna fled, but was eventually found and beheaded by her father. In time, stories emerged of miracles at her burial site. She became the patron saint of the mentally ill, the anguished, the possessed. By the 12th century, Geel had become a sanctuary. Families brought their mad children, their grieving mothers, their raving sons to Dymphna's shrine. There, rituals were performed, masses, blessings, anointings. But what made Geel unique was not only the shrine itself, it was the village. The townspeople began to take the afflicted into their homes, not as patients, but as boarders, as family. They lived together, worked together, and though not all found healing, many found peace. Elsewhere, sacred wells were visited by those seeking relief. St. Winfried's Well in Wales, known for its healing waters, became a site of pilgrimage for those with both physical and mental ailments. Pilgrims bathed in the spring, circled the chapel, tied cloths to the trees nearby, tokens of their suffering, their longing, their belief. These rituals were layered with symbolism: water to cleanse not just the body, but the soul; cloth to carry away illness; circles to mirror eternity, the turning of time and pain into renewal. To the medieval mind, healing was not linear. It was a mystery, sometimes instantaneous, sometimes subtle, sometimes incomplete. Relics, too, held great power. Bones of saints, shards of the true cross, fragments of robes. These objects were believed to carry the sanctity of the holy into the material world. To touch a relic, or even come near it, was to draw close to God. And for the mad, whose suffering was often seen as a distance from the divine, this closeness was everything. In cathedrals and churches, relics were kept in ornate reliquaries, golden boxes, crystal cases, carved ivory caskets. They were paraded on feast days, lifted high above the heads of weeping crowds. In the presence of such holiness, pilgrims collapsed, cried out, fell silent. Some claimed visions, others claimed peace. One chronicler tells of a man who had not spoken in 12 years. He was led to the shrine of St. Cuthbert, where monks prayed over him and placed the saint's girdle around his shoulders. That night, he dreamed of fire and water. The next morning, he whispered a single word, his name. It is impossible to know what truly happened in such cases. Perhaps the mind, pushed to its limits, responded to belief with sudden restoration. Perhaps the ritual soothed something unseen. Or perhaps the healing was not of the mind, but of the spirit. The relief of being acknowledged, of being part of a story, of no longer being alone. The journey itself was part of the cure. To walk for days, even weeks, to share meals with strangers, to sleep under the stars, it stripped life to its essentials. It created a rhythm that could calm the storm within. Pilgrims sang as they walked, prayed aloud, recited tales, and for those whose minds were fractured, this repetition, this simplicity, could bring moments of lucidity. Not every pilgrim returned healed. Many did not return at all, but those who did often spoke not just of miracles, but of transformation. They came back changed, not always cured, but seen. And so the roads remained busy, year after year, through plague, famine, war, and winter. A tapestry of feet moving steadily toward hope. In the next part of our journey, we will explore the gendered experience of madness, how women and men were perceived differently in their suffering, what madness looked like in the eyes of a father, a mother, a wife, a monk, and how for many the mind's torment was inseparable from the role they were forced to play. But for now, rest beneath the vaulted sky of a pilgrim's dream. Let the stars be relics, the earth a shrine, and let your own thoughts walk the quiet road toward some hidden place of peace. The room was small, barely larger than a storage closet. A thin mattress lay on the floor with straw scattered beneath it to catch the damp. The woman who sat inside had once been a wife, a mother, a neighbor. Now she was simply called the Weeping One. Her cries echoed down the stone corridors day and night, soft, rhythmic, endless. The nuns prayed for her. The priest avoided her. The villagers said she had gone mad after childbirth. Others whispered of possession, but no one spoke of grief. In the medieval world, madness wore different faces depending on who bore it. A man's rage might be seen as a warrior's temper, a noble flaw. A woman's anger was hysteria. A man who withdrew into silence might be called contemplative. A woman who did the same was accused of witchcraft or sorrow without cause. The line between madness and identity was drawn not just by behavior, but by gender. For women, the path to madness was paved with expectations. To be pious, obedient, silent. To marry well, bear children, tend to others. Their lives were circumscribed by roles that left little room for strangeness, no space for wildness. When their minds strained against those boundaries, through trauma, loss, desire, or despair, there were few places left to turn. One of the most common triggers for female madness in medieval accounts was childbirth. Women who had lost infants, or who themselves nearly died in labor, were often described as broken in the mind. They saw things others could not. They spoke to the dead. They wept for hours. What we now recognize as postpartum depression or psychosis was in their time a mysterious affliction that marked them as unstable, sometimes even dangerous. These women might be kept indoors, watched by servants, confined to upper rooms. There are stories of noble women who refused to speak after the deaths of their children. They stopped eating. They paced their chambers at night, holding phantom bundles in their arms. Some were placed under the care of confessors. Others were quietly moved to convents, where their silence could be mistaken for sanctity. But it was not only grief that could unravel the mind. Desire, too, could lead to a woman's fall from reason, especially when it transgressed the boundaries of her expected role. A woman who loved outside of marriage, who resisted the hand chosen for her, or who dared to seek pleasure for herself, might be labeled mad. Her emotions were not her own. They were sent by Satan, kindled by the moon, brought on by spells. And yet, within these condemnations, there were also stories of defiance. Mystics like Julian of Norwich and Marjorie Kempe spoke openly of their visions, their emotional torrents, their intense bodily experiences of the divine. Marjorie, in particular, wept constantly in public, fell into trances, and claimed to speak directly with Christ. Many considered her mad, yet she documented her experiences, dictated them, since she could not write, and preserved them in a text now considered one of the first autobiographies in English. Men, too, suffered, but their madness was often read through a different lens. A knight who returned from war, broken by what he had seen, might be said to suffer from divine punishment or spiritual trial. He was more likely to be treated with solemnity than with fear. A monk who fasted and wept uncontrollably might be revered for his holiness, even as his mind drifted far from earthly concerns. Masculine madness, when not violent, could be hidden more easily. A man might retreat to a monastery, live in quiet seclusion, and be praised for his humility. His suffering became a form of penance, a pathway to redemption. For women, the same withdrawal might be seen as neglect of duty. Madness in a man could be noble. In a woman, it was failure. And yet, in the hidden places, behind cloister walls, in the still rooms of widows, in the corners of village kitchens, women found ways to care for one another. They passed down knowledge of calming teas, of moon cycles, of healing chants. They recognized the signs that others ignored. They whispered comfort to the grieving, distracted the disoriented with small tasks, and held hands through long, sleepless nights. Sister Magdalene, a nun from a small convent near the Rhine, kept a secret book of the women she had known. In it, she recorded dreams, fears, symptoms no physician could treat. One entry told of a woman who saw crows before her headaches came. Another described a girl who forgot her own name but recited the Psalms flawlessly each morning. These were not medical records. They were acts of remembrance. Men's madness was written into chronicles, poems, and ballads. Women's was written into linen, into lullabies, into silence. Even in death, the difference persisted. A madman might be buried with prayers for his soul. A madwoman might be buried at a crossroads beneath a pile of stones to prevent her spirit from wandering. The injustice was woven into the soil. But not all stories ended in tragedy. There are letters, rarely discussed, that speak of women who returned, who found peace. A mother who regained speech after planting a garden. A daughter who stopped seeing visions after a pilgrimage. A widow who found comfort in the rhythm of prayer beads. Healing, when it came, was not from cures, but from gentleness, from patience, from being allowed to be something other than what the world demanded. In the next part of our journey, we will explore the seasons of madness, how time itself shaped the rhythms of the mind, the role of the moon, of feast days, of long winters and sudden springs. For in the medieval imagination, time was not just a measure, it was a force. But for now, let the candle burn low in the chamber of the weeping one. Let her rest. Let her tears fall into sleep like rain on stone, gentle and unnoticed, until morning comes. The frost clung to the monastery windows like lace spun by the breath of spirits. Outside, the fields lay silent under a thin veil of snow, and the trees stood skeletal against the gray sky. Inside, the monks moved slowly through their daily rhythm, prayer, work, silence. But one of them, Brother Thomas, had not left his cell in 3 days. He had stopped eating. He did not speak. When the bell tolled for matins, he turned his face to the wall. The prior concerned did not send punishment. He sent warm broth and a soft-voiced novice to sit nearby and wait. For in the winter, madness came more often. The medieval world was shaped not by clocks, but by seasons. Time flowed with the rising and falling of the sun, the planting and harvest, the liturgical calendar. And within this rhythm, people believed that the mind, too, had its tides, drawn by the moon, stirred by the wind, shadowed by winter. It was common belief that certain times of year were more likely to bring madness. In spring, when the world awoke in sudden color and scent, people were said to grow restless, fevered, overly passionate. The sap rose in the trees and in the blood. Tempers flared. Sleep fled. Dreams became wild. For some, this energy brought renewal. For others, it brought unraveling. In summer, the heat baked the earth and sometimes the brain. Cases of what physicians called mania were said to rise. People laughed too loudly, wandered naked into rivers, claimed they could speak to stars. The warm nights brought sleeplessness, and sleeplessness brought visions. It was whispered that demons moved more freely in the summer, thinner veils between worlds, the devil's breath hot in the hedgerows. Autumn brought its own peculiar madness, a quiet kind, more inward. As the leaves fell, so too did spirits. A kind of sadness moved through villages like mist. The harvest was over, the light was retreating. It was in this season that monks often recorded an increase in melancholia. The black bile, they wrote, thickens in the cooling air. A man may turn inward. A woman may cry without knowing why. Nothing is wrong and yet everything is. But it was winter that carried the heaviest weight. The long nights, the cold that settled into bones and did not lift, the silence. It was during these months that solitude became dangerous. A person might spend too many hours alone, watching the flame of a single candle, hearing footsteps that were not there. The snow muffled sound, and the mind filled the emptiness. Acedia, the noonday demon, described by monastic writers, found its deepest roots in these seasons. It was not just sadness, it was a kind of spiritual fatigue, weariness of prayer, of effort, of being. A monk might rise in the morning, go through the motions, but feel hollow. He might sit with his brothers, but hear nothing. Acedia was often mistaken for sloth, for sin. But those who lived through it knew otherwise. It was a fog of the soul. The phases of the moon, too, were blamed for stirring the mind. Luna, goddess of the moon, root of the word lunatic, was said to draw madness from the depths like the tide. On full moons, midwives swore that children were born in greater numbers. Shepherds claimed their flocks grew skittish. And those already suffering in the mind? They raved. They broke things. They sang through the night in tongues no one taught them. Some healers watched the moon before prescribing herbs. A person plagued by sleeplessness might be treated differently if the moon was waxing or waning. Charms were buried beneath full moons and illnesses named aloud beneath new ones. Time was not a backdrop, it was a medicine, a warning, a companion. Holy days, too, held power. There were saints, days on which madness was said to lift, if only briefly. Pilgrimages timed to these days were believed to be more effective. The Feast of St. John near midsummer was especially feared and revered. Fires were lit, herbs were burned, and wild dances filled the village green. It was a night when the veil thinned, when dreams bled into waking life, when those considered mad were watched more closely or invited to lead the dance. In the countryside, people still practiced older rituals tied to the seasons. Bonfires at solstice, offerings at harvest, songs sung to the dying year. These rites were not seen as medicine, but they served a purpose. They marked time. They gave shape to suffering. They reminded those lost in their minds that the world still turned, that the wheel would rise again. Even in monasteries, where the liturgical calendar ruled, time was not just sacred, it was soothing. The bell rang 7 times a day. Psalms were read in their order. Feasts followed fasts. Within this order, some found comfort. The predictability of time became a balm for the disordered soul. And yet, time was not always kind. There were anniversaries that reopened wounds. The date of a death, the day a child disappeared, the season when illness first arrived. For some, these were harder than the illness itself, a reliving of sorrow, year after year. And so, caregivers learned to watch not just the person, but the calendar. They knew who would worsen in February, who would grow restless in April, who would smile again when the apples ripened. They learned to prepare. Extra prayer, warmer blankets, gentler hands. In the next part of our journey, we will step into the world of medieval dreams, not as symbols, but as real experiences, portals, omens, warnings. For in the medieval mind, sleep was not a break from the world, but a journey through it. But for now, let the wheel of the year turn softly. Let winter wrap around you like wool. Let your thoughts slow like the river under ice. The seasons will shift again. They always do. The chamber was dim, lit only by the faint silver glow of moonlight slipping through the lattice window. On a narrow cot, a young man stirred in his sleep, his breath quickening, fingers twitching beneath the linen sheet. His lips moved without sound. Then, suddenly, his eyes flew open, wild, glistening, terrified. He sat up, drenched in sweat, staring into the darkness as though it had spoken his name. The dream had returned. In the Middle Ages, dreams were not trifles of the unconscious. They were not dismissed with morning yawns or idle curiosity. Dreams were messages, omens, divine visitations, or demonic temptations. They were doors through which the soul traveled while the body lay still. And for those suffering from mental illness, dreams often became the very terrain of their torment, or at times their healing. To the medieval mind, sleep was a vulnerable state. It was believed that while the body rested, the soul ascended or descended to realms beyond. In monasteries, dreams were recorded, pondered, even confessed. A monk who dreamt of angels might wake feeling blessed. One who dreamt of fire, serpents, or falling might rise shaken, afraid his soul had brushed against damnation. Those considered mad often had vivid, disturbing dreams. They spoke of flames underfoot, of voices calling from wells, of eyes in the walls. These were not always dismissed as delusions. In some places, people believed the mad had a closer connection to the spirit world, that their dreams, though terrifying, were truths too raw for the waking world to accept. Physicians of the time, drawing on ancient texts by Galen and Avicenna, believed dreams could be caused by imbalance of the humors. Too much black bile might bring nightmares. Too much blood, fevered visions. Dreams were read as symptoms, as signs of the body's inner state. But others believed dreams were the soul's language, unfiltered by reason, stripped of pretense. There were dream books, passed from hand to hand, listing common images and their meanings. To dream of water could mean sorrow or baptism. To dream of a broken cup might foretell death in the family. These books, sometimes written in Latin, sometimes in the vernacular, gave structure to the unstructured, making sense of the nightly descent into the unknown. But not all dreams were welcome. Some afflicted individuals could not tell where dreams ended and reality began. They would wake screaming, clawing at their own skin, convinced they were still being chased by shadows. Others refused to sleep at all, terrified of what waited behind their eyelids. A girl in northern France was said to sleep sitting up, back pressed against the chapel wall, so the dream wolves couldn't find her. A man near Siena wore bells on his wrists so that if he thrashed in sleep, he would wake himself. There were tales of dreams that healed. One chronicler tells of a woman who had not spoken in years. One night, she dreamt of a dove resting on her chest. When she woke, she wept and sang a hymn she had learned as a child. No one knew what had changed, only that her eyes were clear for the first time in memory. In another account, a young boy tormented by visions was laid before a reliquary and left to sleep in the chapel. That night, he dreamt of a knight in golden armor slaying a beast that had wrapped around his body. In the morning, he spoke clearly, asked for bread, and pointed to the altar, saying, "It is quiet now." For many, dreams were more than just images. They were events, real, lasting, a place they returned to again and again. Monks sometimes fasted and prayed to induce visionary dreams. Anchorites recorded theirs in tiny crab script on the backs of psalters. Women in convents dreamt of Christ placing his hand on their chest or offering them burning hearts. These dreams were rapturous, overwhelming, and often left the dreamer altered. Some never fully returned from them. But dreams could also be used as evidence against the dreamer. If a woman claimed to have dreamt of flying or of secret knowledge, she could be accused of witchcraft. If a man said angels spoke to him at night but offered him no guidance, he might be deemed possessed. Dreams, when they strayed from orthodoxy, became suspect, dangerous. And so, people grew careful with their dreams. They shared them only with confessors or kept them locked behind their teeth. Yet even in silence, the dreams continued. Some healers used dreams as diagnosis. They would ask the afflicted to describe what they saw in sleep, then offer remedies. Mugwort to ward off night spirits, rue beneath the pillow, prayers whispered before bed. In certain households, a charm was hung above the sleeper, a sprig of ash tied with red thread, or a circle drawn with chalk on the floor. These acts were not superstition alone. They were expressions of hope, of care. Dreams were often the last frontier for the afflicted. When the waking world grew unbearable, when their speech failed or was no longer trusted, their dreams became the place they lived. A mother who forgot her children's names might call them clearly in sleep. A man who barked like a dog by day might recite poetry in his dreams, and sometimes the dream lingered into waking. There are stories of people who, after years of torment, spoke of one final dream, calm, golden still, a garden, a warm hand, a bell tolling softly, and after that they changed, not cured, but softened, quieted, as though something within had been seen and acknowledged at last. In the next part of our journey, we will listen to the voices of the caregivers and chroniclers, those who recorded the madness of others not in fear, but in love. Those who dared to preserve these stories, to give them names, to bear witness even when the world turned away. But for now, close your eyes. Let the dream find you, slow and strange. Let the images come and pass like lanterns on a black river. You are safe here. The night is long but not cruel, and the soul, even in its wandering, remembers the way home. The parchment was brittle, its edges darkened by time and smoke. A scribe leaned over it carefully, tracing each line with his eyes before pressing his quill into the ink pot once more. The words he wrote were not of kings or wars, but of a woman who had not spoken in 8 years, save to sing a hymn on the feast of St. Lucy. He wrote of her trembling hands, her strange laughter, the way she wept when it rained. His tone was not clinical, it was reverent. The chronicle he was composing was not a diagnosis, it was a testimony. In the quiet corners of monastic libraries, in the marginalia of devotional books, in the back pages of family ledgers, stories of the mentally afflicted were kept, not always with understanding, but often with a kind of reluctant tenderness. The people who recorded these tales, the monks, the sisters, the caregivers, the neighbors, became the memory of those whose minds had unraveled. Without them, so many lives would have vanished like breath on glass. These chroniclers were not physicians. They were observers, caretakers, sometimes reluctant participants in another's private storm. They did not always understand what they saw, but they understood that it mattered. Brother Aelred, a monk in northern England, kept a weathered notebook filled with what he called souls in shadow. Each entry bore a name, a brief description, and what little he knew of their affliction. Eustace, aged 27, struck dumb by thunder on the feast of St. Martin, screams now at bells, sleeps beside the sheep. Or Juliana, daughter of the cooper, believed her mother speaks through the fire, washes her hands until they bleed. He did not mock them, he prayed for them, and he remembered. Elsewhere in convents, nuns wrote letters to distant abbeys asking for prayers for sisters who had withdrawn from the world. One letter reads, "Sister Agnes no longer joins us for Compline. She sits by the window all day, murmuring in Greek, though she never learned the tongue. Her eyes are not here. We sing to her as we bake the bread." There were even secular chroniclers, barber surgeons, midwives, travelers, who kept informal accounts, not for science or faith, but out of a need to preserve the extraordinary, the inexplicable. In the margins of ledgers listing grain and livestock, one might find Margot, gone mad with grief after her eldest drowned, believes she is a heron, flaps arms, cries when it rains. These notes may seem small, but they held power. They gave the mad a place in the world. They named them. They bore witness. For many afflicted souls, these records were the only proof they had lived. Sometimes the scribes wrote from love. A brother who chronicled his sister's descent into silence. She sang so sweetly once. Now she covers her ears when the choir practices. A father who kept a notebook of his son's night terrors, sketching little stars next to days when the boy smiled. A nun who wrote poems in the margins of her psalter for the sister who no longer recognized her. One such poem reads, "She walks in silence, hands like wings, eyes full of yesterday's wind. I hold her name upon my tongue, a bell that does not ring." These writings, humble and hidden, were acts of resistance against forgetting, against fear, against the urge to look away. But not all chroniclers were kind. Some recorded the afflicted with suspicion, warning others to avoid them. Beware the boy with black eyes in the orchard. He speaks backward and calls crows with his breath. Others describe the mad in terms of sin, proof of divine punishment, a family's shame. And yet even these harsh accounts reveal the enduring presence of the mentally ill in medieval life. They were not invisible. They were unavoidable. Even when ignored, they were spoken of. One town record includes fines levied against a man who locked his brother in a barn, fearing his strange mutterings would offend the bishop. A local priest wrote of a woman whose blasphemies during Mass led her to be removed, but who returned the next week with flowers and no memory of what had happened. The records don't try to solve these mysteries. They simply record them, like placing a stone on a grave. In some cases, the mad were allowed to speak for themselves, briefly, imperfectly. In a rare surviving letter from the 14th century, a woman believed to be touched in the mind writes to her confessor. Her script is uneven, the Latin flawed, but the message is unmistakable. "I am not gone. I am only lost. Please light a candle for me. I do not fear the dark, but I forget how to return." That letter, folded and worn, was kept in the priest's prayer book until his death. Even art became a form of chronicling. Tapestries depicted wild-eyed figures fleeing from devils only they could see. Marginalia in illuminated manuscripts showed monks with birds perched on their heads, or women pulling their own hair. Strange, yes, but not cruel. These images, tucked beside saints and angels, suggested that the mad, too, had a place in the divine story. And perhaps that was the greatest gift the chroniclers gave: inclusion. By writing their names, describing their days, even capturing their confusion and terror, they wove the afflicted into the fabric of history. They reminded the world that madness was not otherness. It was part of the human condition. It walked among us. It sang, it wept, it prayed. In the next part of our journey, we will follow the afterlives of these stories, how the memory of the mad lingered after death, how legends grew from real lives, how saints, spirits, and shadows carried traces of those whose minds once wandered under medieval skies. But for now, let us thank the ones who wrote, the quiet hands that recorded the tremble of others. Let their words echo in the stillness, like footsteps in a cloister long gone. Let them remind us that to witness is to honor, and to remember is to love. The village bell rang once, slow and solemn, as the sun dipped below the hills and the sky turned to a soft lavender dusk. In the churchyard, the earth had been turned for a fresh grave. no one spoke. The figure they laid to rest had died without family, without words, and some whispered, without sense. Her name, if it had ever been known, was not carved on the wooden marker. Yet someone had placed wildflowers on her shroud, freshly picked from the field. Someone had remembered. In death, the mad often slipped further from the world of the living. Their names faded, their stories distorted, their graves sometimes left unmarked. But they did not vanish. Instead, they passed into legend, into warning, into myth. Across the medieval landscape, the memories of those whose minds had unraveled took on new shapes. They became saints, spirits, specters. They haunted crossroads, whispered in abbey halls, appeared in dreams and in the pauses between bells. Death, for the mad, was not always the end of being seen. It was sometimes the beginning of being told. One such story comes from a forested region in the east, where a woman known only as Ellen the Silent was said to have wandered barefoot for years. She slept beneath trees, ate nothing but roots and berries, and was seen speaking to crows. When she died, curled up beside a ruined chapel, hands clasped as if in prayer, the villagers buried her at the edge of the churchyard, unsure whether she was blessed or cursed. But not long after, strange things began to happen. A child who fell from a tree was found unhurt, claiming that the quiet lady had caught him. A blind man who rested at her grave claimed he dreamed of light and woke with his sight restored. Her name passed between lips like a secret. Ellen the Silent became a protector, a saint without canonization, a whisper of kindness from beyond. Her madness, once feared, had become a mantle of power. There were other stories too, darker ones. A man called Gervais the Laugher, who wandered towns in fits of cruel mirth, was said to have been struck mad by a broken oak. When he died, no one claimed his body. He was buried at a crossroads, the traditional place for suicides and the unrested. After that, travelers spoke of hearing laughter in the wind near the marker. Horses refused to cross the path. Mothers warned children to avoid the place, lest Gervais return to steal their voices. In these tales, the mad dead were not forgotten. They became part of the land's memory. Church records occasionally reflected these transformations. Margins in death registers might carry cryptic notations, buried under protest, or no prayers offered, or watched for 3 nights. These phrases hint at ancient fears that the soul of the mad could wander after death, could return unsettled. And yet, some mad were honored in death in ways they were not in life. Certain monastic orders buried their afflicted brothers within the cloister walls, beside abbots and scribes. The belief was that suffering borne with patience, even if confused or wild, was a form of devotion. One monk, Brother Sebastian, who had been silent for 30 years, was said to have smiled at the hour of his death and whispered, "The veil is gone." His grave was marked simply, "Servant of Mystery." Pilgrimage sites also became resting places for the mad. Those who died seeking healing were sometimes buried on holy ground, regardless of status or clarity of mind. And over time, their stories fused with those of saints. It became difficult to know where one ended and the other began. Families, too, kept their own private rituals of memory. A mother might place a carved token in the soil where her troubled daughter lay. A brother might visit a field each year on the anniversary of a loss, whispering a name into the wind. These acts did not appear in records, but they endured, in silence, in custom, in the shape of grief worn into everyday life. And sometimes, memories took root in superstition, a grove of trees avoided by locals because a madman once hanged himself there. A river bend called the Whispering Pool, where a woman who spoke in riddles drowned. These places became stories, and the people behind them, however distorted, were not lost. They became part of a deeper landscape, a shared understanding that madness lingered, not only in minds, but in the very soil. Some saints, too, were once considered mad. Their visions were doubted, their fasting ridiculed, their voices dismissed, but in death, they were exalted, their relics touched, their names prayed. The mad became holy, and the holy, once mad, became intercessors for those still suffering. The medieval world did not discard the memory of the mad. It reshaped it, through fear, through reverence, through story. Their afterlives were mosaics of pain and wonder, woven into the fabric of collective memory. In the next part of our journey, we will reflect on how the legacy of medieval madness carried forward. how echoes of these ancient understandings lingered into the Renaissance and beyond, shaping how we still speak of mental illness today. But for now, let us walk softly through the twilight graveyard. Let the grass grow tall around the forgotten stones. Let the stories settle like dew. For though the voices have gone quiet, they are not gone. They remain, waiting, listening, remembering. The candlelight flickered across the worn pages of a physician's journal, dated in the early 16th century. The ink was darker than the fading script of the centuries before. The language had shifted, Latin giving way to early forms of vernacular, the tone more analytical, less reverent. The world was changing, and with it so too was the understanding of the human mind. The medieval age was drawing to a close. The Renaissance was waking, slowly, like a great beast, stirring beneath a heavy mantle. Cities were growing, trade routes stretching. Books were being printed in numbers once unimaginable. New knowledge was being unearthed, questioned, scattered like seeds in the wind. But amid this blossoming of reason and art, the shadows of medieval beliefs about madness lingered. Old and new clashed constantly in the understanding of mental illness. On the one hand, ancient humoral theories still held sway. Physicians continued to attribute melancholy to black bile, mania to an excess of yellow. Treatments remained tied to balance, diet, bloodletting, purgatives. The stars were still consulted, the moon still feared. Dream books remained beside many sickbeds, and in the countryside, the whispers of folk cures and charms continued, barely touched by the changing times. Yet something subtle had shifted. People began to write about madness not only as a punishment or possession, but as a condition of the mind. Not the soul, not the heavens, the mind. There was no formal psychology, not yet, but the idea that the brain might itself be the source of madness had begun to take root, slowly, tentatively, like a blade of green through snow. This new way of thinking did not erase the old. Rather, the two began to coexist in strange, overlapping ways. A woman might still be accused of witchcraft if her visions came at the wrong time or to the wrong ears, but another might be treated with herbal teas, fresh air, and cheerful company. A man who heard voices might still be brought to the church for exorcism, but he might also be sent to a physician who would recommend music, light, and the removal of offending vapors. The writings of ancient Greek and Roman thinkers, long preserved in dusty monastic libraries, were now being copied, studied, debated. Galen and Hippocrates were not discarded, they were revived, and their theories, when combined with new observations and empirical curiosity, began to reshape how some saw the mind. But it was a slow transformation. Many institutions remained unchanged. Bedlam still housed the mad in cold rooms. The poor still wandered the streets. Families still hid afflicted members behind closed doors, afraid of shame or accusation. And in many parts of Europe, those who suffered were still beaten, mocked, even killed for their behavior. And yet this age gave us something unexpected, art that looked inward. During the Renaissance, painters and poets began to explore the mind in deeper, more nuanced ways. Madness appeared in the faces of saints, not as monstrosity, but as suffering. In the brushstrokes of Bosch and Bruegel, we see chaos and confusion, but also familiarity. The fool in the town square is not merely laughed at, he is recognized. Writers, too, began to reflect on madness not as otherness, but as part of being human. In the pages of poetry and drama, madness became a mirror, a place where grief, guilt, passion, and memory swirled together. Not evil, not divine, simply human. In some court records of the time, we begin to see legal distinctions between crime and madness. Inheritance laws begin to consider mental competence. Guardianship is invoked for those unable to manage their affairs. These were the seeds of recognition, not yet mercy, but order. Society, for all its fear, was beginning to acknowledge that madness was not always a choice. There were even early attempts at treatment beyond containment. Some wealthy families hired companions, trusted servants, scholars, even artists, to live with afflicted relatives and offer comfort, stimulation, structure. Music was played, gardens cultivated, stories read aloud. These were not universal practices, they were rare, but they marked a shift. And still the ghost of the Middle Ages remained. People still believed in possession, in curses, in punishment for sins. And sometimes they were right to believe that the world was unjust, because it was. Those with tormented minds still suffered in silence. They still died alone. they still became the subjects of whispered stories. But in those final medieval years, standing on the edge of something new, the memory of centuries of suffering began to settle into something else: reflection. The church, too, began to change. While exorcism remained, so did a growing recognition that care, not fear, was needed. Some monasteries established special cells not for punishment, but for rest. Some bishops called for the mad to be treated with dignity, not scorn. Words like mercy, sorrow, and understanding began to appear in pastoral letters. In one such letter, a bishop wrote, "Let those who are lost in their minds not be cast aside, for the mind is but a garden, and even the most overgrown may yet bloom again." The records of the mad, once hidden or burned, began to be copied and preserved. Not all, not most, but enough. Enough that their stories survive. Enough that we can hear them still. In the next part, we will journey into the final echoes of this long shadow, the transition from medieval madness to early modern madness, the rise of reason, the beginning of institutions, the birth of new languages to describe the mind. But tonight, pause with the candle low. Think of those who walked through both worlds, half holy, half haunted, who stood at the edge of one age and gazed, blinking, into the next. They did not know what would come, but they endured, and in their enduring, they gave us a beginning. The morning fog clung to the rooftops of the town like a veil, muffling the clatter of carts and the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer. Somewhere beyond the marketplace, behind thick stone walls and a wooden gate barred from within, a man sat on a bench in a narrow courtyard. He stared at his hands, unmoving, as if waiting for them to speak. Around him, others wandered aimlessly, muttering to themselves or sitting in silence. The building was called a hospital, but there was little healing here. It was 1601, and the age of confinement had begun. With the end of the Middle Ages came a new age, not yet enlightened, but more structured, more watchful, more suspicious of what could not be categorized. The loose, uncertain margins where the mad had once lived, among pilgrims, saints, mystics, and fools, began to close. Madness, once a mystery threaded with awe and fear, was being redefined, not as vision, not as punishment, but as deviation, as disorder. In towns and cities, new institutions were rising, places specifically designed to contain those considered unfit for public life. These were not the makeshift monastic cells or the quiet corners of shrines where the afflicted had once sought shelter. These were buildings of stone and schedule, locks and ledgers. Here, madness was no longer a spiritual journey. It was a problem to be managed. The era of the madhouse had begun. Unlike the sacred spaces of pilgrimage or the rural kindness of village traditions, these institutions were often harsh, impersonal, and deeply hierarchical. The mad were no longer touched by mystery. They were labeled, sorted, hidden. In France, in England, across the Holy Roman Empire, confinement was growing into policy. The poor, the idle, the vagrant, and the mentally ill were swept together into houses of correction. Madness was no longer seen as exceptional. It was seen as dangerous. And with confinement came silence. The voices of the mad, once heard in the marketplace, the chapel, the woods, were now muffled by thick doors and barred windows. Where once they had been interpreted by priests or mystics or poets, they were now recorded by clerks, observed from a distance, counted, but not heard. But still, within these walls, life unfolded. There were moments of humanity. A nurse who sang lullabies to a woman who had forgotten her own name. A young boy who drew pictures on the floor with chalk, even though no one understood what they meant. A man who recited lines of Virgil every morning, precisely, like a ritual. These moments went unnoticed by most, but they mattered. And outside the walls, the world was changing its language. New words were being born. Melancholia, hysteria, mania, not from faith, but from early medicine. Physicians, now more distinct from priests, began to catalog symptoms, to classify behaviors, to observe and describe, though often without understanding. The body was dissected, the mind, not yet. But even in this new clinical approach, echoes of the old world remained. Melancholia was still linked to black bile. Women were still blamed for wandering wombs that disturbed their thoughts. The moon remained an object of suspicion. And though demons had begun to fade from medical texts, they had not faded from the fears of ordinary people. Families still whispered when madness entered the home. A daughter who wept too often might be married off quickly. A son who spoke to himself might be sent to sea. A grandmother who wandered the fields at night might be locked inside for her own good. The language had changed, but the shame had not. And yet, new voices began to stir. Writers and thinkers of the early modern period, Shakespeare, Cervantes, Erasmus, began to explore madness in new ways. Their madmen were tragic, yes, but also wise. Their fools, ridiculous but insightful. Their madwomen wept not because they were cursed, but because the world had broken something inside them. In Hamlet, madness becomes a mirror for grief and guilt. In Don Quixote, it becomes a question of reality itself. Is the knight mad or merely more honest than the world around him? These were not theological questions. They were human ones. And in these stories, we see a shift, not away from mystery, but toward empathy. The mad were no longer simply possessed or punished. They were wounded, confused, misunderstood, and in some rare cases, cherished. One small hospital in southern Germany, funded by a local merchant's will, included a garden for the mad, a quiet space with herbs, birds, and benches. The records say that one patient, who had not spoken in 3 years, began to hum after sitting there daily. Another began to write verses again. Not a cure, not a miracle, but something gentle, something different. These small moments mattered. They were seeds. In the next and final parts of our journey, we will gather the threads we have followed through faith, fear, silent song, and trace the legacy they left behind. How the medieval understanding of madness, with all its wonder and terror, still echoes in our world, in our language, in our dreams. But for now, let the gate remain closed. Let the footsteps inside fall quiet. Let the past breathe. The age has turned, but the stories remain, waiting to be remembered. The wind rustled gently through the cloister garden, passing over herbs long harvested and stones smoothed by centuries of prayer. Somewhere nearby, bells chimed softly in the tower, marking none of the great hours, only the passage of time. A monk sat alone beneath an old yew tree, a book open on his lap, though he was not reading. His gaze drifted, unfocused, as if watching memories instead of words. The world had changed, but the echoes remained. As the Middle Ages faded into the tapestry of history, the understanding of madness did not vanish. It transformed. It moved from the hands of priests to those of physicians, from the margins of illuminated manuscripts to the pages of philosophical treatises, from whispered superstitions to academic debate. And yet, within every new word, every fresh theory, the ancient voices lingered. They were never truly silent. The mad of the medieval world, those who wept in towers, danced in market squares, wandered barefoot through forests, or prayed to unseen companions, left no manifestos. But they shaped the soul of their age. They taught those around them what it meant to witness, to fear, to comfort, and to remember. Their lives became the spaces where the human mind met the unknown, where reason trembled and wonder stepped in. Their legacy is not only in the medicine that slowly emerged, or in the laws that were later written, or even in the art that remembered their faces. It is in the questions they forced upon every heart that dared to watch them suffer. What is a person if not their reason? What happens when that reason shifts, breaks, or disappears? And what do we owe to those who drift beyond our understanding? The medieval world did not have our vocabulary, no psychology, no neurology, no diagnoses. But it had story, it had metaphor, it had care. Imperfect? Yes. Often cruel, often mistaken, but not always indifferent. And in some ways, it had a depth we struggle to reclaim. The belief that madness might carry meaning, that sorrow might be sacred, that the soul's silence was not emptiness, but mystery. Today, we speak of mental health in cleaner terms. We chart brain activity, describe disorders, offer therapies and medicines that bring real relief. We have moved forward, and rightly so. But the journey began long before the first asylums, the first textbooks, the first theories. It began in candlelit cells, in forest shrines, in whispered prayers over fevered brows. It began with the stories we've now told. The woman who wept for her lost child and heard her name in the rain. The man who fasted until his body became vision. The child who spoke to angels and was feared for it. The fool who made kings laugh and sometimes weep. The nun who recorded her sister's silence with ink and tenderness. The pilgrim who walked for days just to touch a relic and sleep in peace. The dreamers, the wanderers, the remembered, and the forgotten. They are with us still. In our language, where lunacy still traces the moon's path across our minds. In our art, where madness still holds a mirror to our deepest fears and fragile truths. In our hearts, where the boundaries of understanding remain as tender and trembling as ever. We no longer burn the mad. We no longer crown them as prophets. But we still struggle to see them fully, to listen without fear, to comfort without erasing, to remember without rewriting. And so this story does not end with a cure. It ends with a vigil, a candle left burning in a window, a name spoken softly into the dark, a song remembered when no one else can sing. A promise, perhaps, that we will keep watching, that we will not turn away. For though the bells have long since stopped ringing and the parchment has grown brittle with age, their voices are not gone. They are only waiting, as they always have, for someone to listen. And tonight, we did. Sleep now. Let the tale drift away like smoke from an old censer. Let the shadows settle. Let the silence hold you, not with fear, but with reverence. You have walked far, across centuries in sorrow, through stone halls and starlit paths. Now rest. The story remains.